You.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you to the resident who informed us. Thank you.
I am muted.
Turn your volume
Down.
Okay. And so tomorrow night at the finance meeting, you'll have that declaration of intent to act as lead agency. I'm not going to be here tomorrow night. Rick Morrissey will cover that for me tomorrow night. I'll be happy to entertain questions on the process now or later on, but I'd like to introduce the team right now from River Street Planning, Margaret Irwin and Monica Ryan. Monica Ryan's going to bring us through the presentation, and our land use attorney is Lawrence Howard. So with that said, all yours.
I just have to share my screen. Just a second.
Just in terms of process too, Monica, if we have a question while you're presenting, we'll ask if that's okay rather than we, because then we'll forget. Okay. And I just ask members to go through the chair. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, so I am Monica Ryan from River Street Planning, and I'm going to do sort of an overview of what we've done so far, what the process has been for community engagement, et cetera, and then an overview of the code update. Obviously, it's a long document and we can't cover everything, so we're sort of hitting the highlights, if you will, but we're certainly happy to discuss details, if you want with questions. Our partners throughout the project, we did have a steering committee that was appointed by the city, comprised of members of the community, and there's a list of our community members on the screen. It included neighborhood residents, developers, business owners, Capital District Transportation, CDTA, representative from RPI. So we had a sort of a wide variety of folks on the committee, as well as representation from the ZBA and the Planning Commission. Our project funders, as you know, are the Department of State, Coastal Resources, Local Waterfront Program, and the Troy Redevelopment Foundation. And then, as introduced, not only is the River Street Planning and Lawrence Howard, but we also had Place Alliance, which is a landscape architect and urban design firm, as well as James White, who is an engineer that specializes in flooding and riverine engineering. So he was also instrumental in this project. So our charge had three broad focus sort of elements when we started this process. Like all zoning updates, there's one of the goals should be to modernize the code for changes. This code does date from the 1980s. Some elements are from the 70s, so it was long overdue. So we looked at modern zoning practices that have a practical application for Troy. Not all zoning tools are relevant to cities and Troy specifically. So we did only, we looked at things from that perspective. This is not something that you just, there's nothing boilerplate per se about most of zoning. So it is tailored to Troy. We also focused on streamlining the document. The current code you have is quite cumbersome to use. So that was one of our tasks as well, was to streamline things and present information in a way that's more legible and easier to interpret, user-friendly. Protecting neighborhood character was a key focus. Troy has wonderful neighborhoods. There is still a lot of character. That's one of your greatest assets. So looking at how future development, infill development, and adaptive reuse fits in with the current character rather than your current code, which is actually very suburban, as Steve mentioned, suburban code with suburban standards. Fourth, increasing opportunities for people to live, work, and play in the same neighborhoods, and supporting development practices that promote sustainability and resilience. Those are two key phrases in the planning world these days. You know, resilience and sustainability are really important, and I think this code does a good job of being on the leading edge of that. And then lastly, updating your permitting and review process. This is an area where the code actually did need a lot of work. While it is less interesting and more dry, it really should help your boards and your city staff to do their jobs. So that was actually, there was quite a bit of time spent on actually those aspects of things. So the steps in the process to date, just a quick overview of how we went about this. First of all, you look at your existing code and you talk about what's working and what's not working. And we talked to the committee about that. We talked to representatives from the ZBA and Planning Commission and city staff. We held a lot of meetings just talking through how things are functioning today. And then we looked at the city itself in terms of field analysis, current development patterns, and land use to see how that relates to the current code and what we might need to change there. We also reviewed the comprehensive plan because, as you know, the comprehensive plan is sort of the guiding document for all planning, for the general planning of the city and services going forward. Zoning codes do need to reflect the comprehensive plan. They do go together. So once you updated your comprehensive plan in 2018, it was really important that you then did a zoning update because they were not in sync and they need to be from a legal perspective.
Monica?
Yes.
Real quick.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people, we've heard, you know, quite extensively during a pretty controversial development project, which you probably might have heard about or even seen. But you know, it was raised quite a bit about the comprehensive plan. And, you know, my interactions and workings with comp plans is, as you just stated, more of a guiding document and more the 500-foot level. And this, though, is more the enacting legislation for that comp plan because the comp plan is more of a vision. This is the enacting legislation for that vision. Would you characterize that?
I think that's fairly accurate.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good characterization. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
We did look at the variance applications that the ZBA has seen over a bunch of years because that sort of can be a telling tale of whether your code's working. If you're seeing a lot of variance requests and you're approving them, then that suggests that your code is not in sync with what the the boards are actually looking to do. If you're not approving them, that might suggest that, you know, what you have is fine. What we did find was that there are a lot of variances being approved. There are a lot of things that may not have been, but we saw over and over again the same themes. And those were clear signs of things that needed to be changed. So that was an important part of our work. We did review other codes in the Northeast, all different states, also focused on New York State because we have our own zoning frameworks here, just to see what everybody else is doing. And sometimes you get some really good ideas there. We worked with the steering committee. We had 16 meetings, I counted, in person, and then most were ending up on Zoom, but that did work fairly well. They were a nice dedicated group, and I think that was very helpful. And I think we consulted with city staff and leadership approximately 36 times.
That's it.
So yeah, just 36. A lot of them are on Zoom or on conference calls. Sometimes in the park during the pandemic, so we could still do something in person. But anyway, that was an instrumental part of this as well. In terms of our community engagement, in 2022, we did kick that off with a planning commission meeting. And then we held 2 community meetings on Zoom in February. We held an in-person open house in March at the Italian Community Center. That was about a 3-hour event where people just came in and we were set up at stations and folks just came in with questions and we talked through things. And then we held one planning commission meeting in March, February, and then we did meet again with them after a bunch of changes were made to go over those. And then just last week, we held there was a planning commission meeting that held a public hearing on on this code. So we were with the planning commission 3 times.
And it should add, they did recommend adoption of the city council.
Right.
We should also say that community members talk to us about.
Do you
the
mind,
river.
Margaret,
no.
using, thanks, just for the public?
The community members did talk to us about things that were important to them and took a very hands-on role in suggesting things. And in most cases, those resulted in modifications and they were good ideas. So it was very hands-on and that was really great to see.
Yeah. Councilmember Gully.
So the input from the public, you would say was important to how you move forward to a process.
Yeah, I think that some of the, the changes that came out of where we started in January with the first full draft to where we are now was largely direct input from just the community engagement we got. We did hear some of the same things, more than once. Those were certainly telling. And then just some ideas, sometimes you just can't think of everything. And so we had a few things that were just like, okay, that's reasonable. Yeah, you do. Yep. And there are, not everything that everybody suggested is in this draft. I mean, there were some things that didn't rise to what we felt were.
Monica, what do you think, dovetailing what Councilmember Gully said, and Margaret, maybe was an overarching theme in some of the public meetings? Was there a constant theme, in terms of
This is way better than the current code. No, to be honest, that was actually a big, most of the input was actually quite positive. Some of the things we did hear, there was concern about allowing for more neighborhood commercial in some of the multifamily residential districts. We had sort of taken it from a different direction and how we crafted it after hearing a lot of feedback, also from some of the Lansingburg folks. Those are the 2 neighborhoods where it really came up because there were a fair amount of multifamily
right.
large swaths of the neighborhood. We did put that piece in, that is so there is now a retail component, neighborhood retail component in this current draft. So that piece did get added in. There was certainly a concern from folks concerned about historic preservation in the downtown, about the heights in the downtown. And so we did take a look at that. We actually spent quite a bit of time trying to just sort out where are the most intact, maybe lower scale in terms of height, portions of downtown's historic district versus areas where there's more opportunity for development that actually also happen to be where some more height could be compatible into the hillside at the waterfront, also where there are some of the larger scale historic buildings. So we did, we re-looked at the downtown in terms of scale quite a bit and made a bunch of adjustments to that, and some tweakings even to the edges of downtown, just north of downtown, just south of downtown. Sort of re-looked at that after some feedback. And we made a few changes to how we handled agriculture and composting and some things like that, where we did hear some feedback. So I would say those are the top. One area that we have not made reflected the change had to do with single family neighborhood zones, which are, of course, part of your current code. We did carry those over where we felt they were important, where there are blocks and blocks of relatively intact single family neighborhoods. We do present the code, and when we talk through that there's 2 different scales of those neighborhoods, and we did treat them differently in terms of the style and character of the 2 neighborhoods when it comes to how they developed, but we did keep that use. There has been some concern about the fact that we haven't stepped away from single family neighborhoods. We did add accessory dwelling units in all residential neighborhoods and mixed use neighborhoods. So So that already adds potentially a dwelling unit to any building. And that is sort of the wave that you are seeing across the country. It's not so much multifamily as it is adding accessory dwelling units as an important, affordable, additional housing option for whether it's young professionals and families or your family members. So that's how we felt that should how we could move towards some of that compatibility while still feeling like the single family home neighborhoods are really important, intact neighborhoods and offer a really important housing choice in the city. A very affordable housing choice relative to single family neighborhoods, say in, the suburbs of communities outside of Troy, and that it's a really important option. So that's intact, but that was something we did here.
For the rest of the council, I have had quite a bit of education on ADUs, accessory dwelling
Yes.
units. If you could maybe take a couple minutes to educate some of the council members that might not be familiar with them. And then secondly, I want to make sure we're not following some municipalities who have legislated ADUs and what the ADUs references in the zoning as compared. I know Albany and Hudson, some municipalities have put in some laws for ADUs. And if you could talk about that.
So sure. So ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are you might have heard granny flats. So if you've heard that term, like that's one of those in-law apartments, right? In-law apartments, things like that, or what they used to be sort of called. And basically, if you're allowing accessory dwelling units, you are allowing in a single family home, or actually it could be a two-family home, could it still have a third unit as an accessory, but you're creating an accessory smaller dwelling unit, whether it's in the principal house or above a garage, or in some communities or even in Troy, if the lots are large enough, maybe as an accessory cottage. They're typically smaller in terms of size, so they're not sky's the limit. It doesn't allow you to basically turn a one family into a two family, although I suppose if the first unit is small enough, it could be, but they're usually capped in size. There's often there can be a owner occupancy component in that you can only have the accessory dwelling unit if you're also an occupant. We do have that in most of the residential districts. We did put that component in, not in the downtown and maybe one other district, but otherwise we did require the owner occupant to also be on the property. We did cap the size of the accessory dwelling units at 800 square feet so that they couldn't be, which is a generous size, but it does keep them somewhat reined in terms of how big you can go. We did also require that there's only one driveway so that you're not creating basically two entirely separate entrances unless it's the alley. And there are a couple of other provisions in there. So we do have a set of additional regulations that go with them, but we did permit them in all of the residential districts and the other mixed use districts. It is in this draft, so that would be part of the ordinance. It's not a standalone section. So it is the wave of zoning. This is becoming much more popular. There are states that are really pushing that at the top level. So I think it is sort of where we're often heading. And I do think it does provide a good, more affordable option for families that need another dwelling unit, but don't want to own a two-family or be in a multifamily situation. So that's sort of the genesis behind it. And, obviously it's entirely up to the city whether they want to go with that approach, but that is how we approached it.
Councilmember Gully.
One quick question. I noticed there's only one front entrance. So if you put an additional accessory dwelling unit on.
So it'd have to be on the side or the rear.
Be inside, or so we have an entrance in the front of the street.
Right. So you could, if you were in a so this really only applies to like the single family district in that sense, because if you're in the 2-family or the multifamily, then you're just a multifamily structure or a 2-family structure, and you can treat those as you would normally treat any 2-family or multifamily.
No, I get it. My curiosity comes that I think that usually in the single family zone, that, you know, like a lot of people might do this for a family relative, a parent or grandparent that they need to take care of. And then that, let's say, as their medical needs increase and as they get older, now you're saying, well, you can't have a front door, you gotta go around to the side. Could that be an inconvenience down the road towards you know, the purpose of having their parents and grandparents there, so they have easy access to the roadway? Just asking.
Yeah.
Curiosity.
It's certainly possible. You know, I didn't really look at it from that perspective. It was more the maintaining the front architect buildings and, you know, making them still look, but no, I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Yeah.
Just curious.
Accessibility in general could be, yeah. That's true. I mean, a side entrance might actually be easier from that perspective for some buildings, or if there's a driveway access, but certainly, yes, that could create some additional access issues for that unit.
Council President.
Councilmember Min.
I'm very happy about accessory dwelling units. I think this is a really important way to protect workforce housing and multi-generational housing. And it's consistent with what we already have in our existing built fabric, and the carriage houses are
Right.
places for people to live, not just horses and cars. I know in past iterations of this, there were caps on height for multifamily. Have those been modified to allow parking underneath, living above?
So for the accessory structures, are you speaking of? Well, we still have a cap on the height. I mean, I believe, and I don't, to be honest, off the top of my head, I can't recall what the accessory structures, and then I think they might actually vary by district.
Okay.
But I believe there's nothing under 20 feet, which should fit a unit above a garage. So I do believe it's something in that nature.
That's tight, and like it, as you're exploring
Mhm.
edits to bring back to us, you want to bump it to something closer like 25. Then that gives some flexibility, because your garage will have to be, you know,
Right.
where the roof lines are. And then just as we're trying to get, you know, cars off the street, and I know for downtown and higher density areas, that's the
Mhm.
major
Yeah.
consideration that allows that flexibility.
Okay.
Um,
We'll take a look at what we have for heights and make sure that.
Yeah.
we-
So we don't have a steady stream of, I need 3 more feet variances.
Right.
Do
I
you
believe
know-
in downtown, I actually think downtown it's quite a bit taller than that.
We
I
want
think it
them
was
to
the,
be everywhere. I want them to be everywhere.
okay.
I think
We'll check the heights.
Yeah, I think we do need to talk about the ADU issue though, and get a flavor for the community. Only I do know it was really highly, strongly controversial in Albany. I don't know why. I don't know what they did different. I know Hudson, I believe, also passed it, but I know AARP obviously is in favor of it, things like that. But I know there was some pushback. You know, the governor had it in the budget.
Oh, yeah.
Statewide.
Mhm.
I do agree with municipality by municipality. I just, I do want to get a flavor for how folks feel, and we should talk about this issue, but I don't want
And we
to.
can pull up the regs too, if you want to see the specifics for the, you know, I mean, I can pull that up, and we can talk about that. Not right this minute.
Yeah, I would
but-
recommend we get the presentation.
Yes.
There's a number
Yep.
of these.
Definitely.
Okay,
Totally agree.
okay. Okay, just very quickly, what zoning is and isn't, just because this does come up. just in terms of, they are regulations. It's a regulatory framework, but it does not control public resources, city land decisions about parks, public streetscape improvements, and other public spaces. So that is not part of what zoning codes regulate. And people do often want the zoning to dictate or provide more guidance on public infrastructure. And it's just not, you can ask the private sector, the private development world to do a certain number of things in that public realm, but most public infrastructure is really not in the wheelhouse of zoning. So it's important to keep in mind. And then also that there are a lot of other regulations and programs that have to do with, that interrelate with zoning but are not zoning, that affect building development every day, use of land every day, including building code, nuisance laws, flood damage prevention and stormwater management regulations, historic preservation and historic district programs, other housing affordability and equity plans. And also, everyone should just keep in mind zoning is not related to real property classifications or assessment. A lot of community members think if your zoning changes, it impacts your assessment, and they are not remotely related. So it's just important to keep that in mind
Good point.
and let your constituents know that when they ask. Sustainability is such a big thing that's brought up in planning that we used to have this slide at the end, but I've moved it to the beginning, basically just to quickly go over some of the things that this code we feel does do. We do believe it increases housing diversity and affordability. We just talked about the ADUs. That's clearly a housing affordability issue. We removed minimum square footage requirements for new dwelling units in new construction. We removed minimum lot size requirements, eliminated automatic parking requirements. We do still require that parking be looked at, but from a different perspective than just automatically triggering certain minimum numbers of parking spaces arbitrarily. And we do allow more diversity of housing types in the multifamily and mixed use neighborhoods. We believe this supports mixed use neighborhoods from the perspective of encouraging a variety of different uses. There's more options for adaptive reuse of existing buildings. We did open up some of the uses for that. More development flexibility for reuse of small infill lots, which we think is really important. Again, your code is so suburban that this was an easy fix. When we protect community character through building form and site development standards, you have those in your code now, but we did bring all of them to a different level. And not only accessory dwelling units for within residences, but also live work units where it is a mixed use district, where there are some commercial and employment opportunities. We believe this supports local food access and agriculture. We maintain the grocery store, which actually current code is pretty permissive of grocery stores. We did carry that through. We also supported a diversity of different farming and personal agriculture. Your code is actually silent on agriculture right now, so there's nothing governing agriculture one way or the other. So we did add actually a comprehensive section on all forms of agriculture to bring that guidance out for the city. And then we required fresh food and produce in grocery store. We have actually requirements as well as convenience stores so that what you're getting are quality stores. We did look at some models from other communities on that. In terms of protecting natural resources and function, there's a waterfront resilience flood protection overlay that talks about protecting the waterfront and actively using the waterfront while also recognizing just the flood risk that exists and how to handle that. We addressed the new climate recovery, let's see, Risk and Resilience Act. It's a new New York State act that went into effect many years ago, but the regulations on that came out more recently, and communities are going to have to respond to that when they're using funding sources or when anybody, even developers, need permits that come through the state. This is going to be something that the city will need to respond to. So we built that into your code so that it's already there for you to use. There's protections for the Hudson River waterfront and other streams and wetlands, steep slopes, conserving and enhancing natural landscapes, thinking about, native plantings, more pollinators, controlling impervious surfaces, and going hand in hand with that, better stormwater management practices, requiring low impact development and green infrastructure. Some of these things are asked for anyway by DEC, but we've taken that also to a better level for urban stormwater management and imperviousness, as the state regulations are not necessarily geared towards that. And then finally, we support solar and wind energy systems. Geothermal are all covered in this code. And then on transportation, we do support, high density urban development.
Monica,
Yes.
I apologize. The grocery stores, you included bodegas in that definition.
So grocery stores are a separate definition from, so basically
They be
convenience stores are
convenient.
capped by size, like the current code. We do have differing sizes. And then grocery stores, so they're separately defined. And then we treated them differently in terms of necessary amounts of fresh fruit and produce. They were treated differently based on the fact that they're different types of stores. And we actually separated also dollar store type, which are small scale variety stores you'll see. That's actually a definition. We did treat them separately as well.
And Monica, I did notice, I was scanning through last night, in the agriculture section, we did increase, I want to say there was potbelly pigs and some other animals, but not roosters.
Right.
And there are a couple of roosters up by Naughty Pine. I know that because I almost hit them on my way home sometimes. But where did we get the basis for that section? Because I think there was potbelly pigs, certain fowl, goats.
Yep.
Can you
So,
get into that a little?
We actually spent a lot of time doing research on different urban
Okay.
codes.
I figured that.
A lot of time. And so this is sort of a combination of some of the codes that look more practical and more realistic to Troy's build out. Also just, we actually talked to a fair amount of, but we actually had folks on the committee who are in urban agriculture in Troy. So that was helpful because they had a lot of thoughts. And then there's already work in other cities. Albany has some examples. So we tried to right size this for Troy, but the models are frankly all over the lot. So there is no one size fits all. Unfortunately, Cornell Cooperative Extension has not put out the perfect model urban agriculture, set of standards that we could all use. That would be really handy. That doesn't exist. So we did pull from a variety of places. Even something like the goats, it was finding out that they generally come in pairs. So if you only allow one, that's not very goat friendly. So if you're going to bother, allow two. Like these are the things I've now
Yeah.
learned, so
Potbelly pigs can get married.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can.
so it was sort of a joint effort and lots of discussion, not necessarily all from some great model, I will say.
Right.
Okay, and one thing, I had requested the whole beehive
Bees,
issue.
yep.
And I
We did-
really want to thank you. I read it. You put some really good time into it. Hopefully it'll work and, allow the responsible
Right.
folks, who are really trying to do the right thing and, hopefully deter the folks who are just not following
Right.
the guidelines or respecting their neighbors.
Right.
So, do you feel?
I'm pretty comfortable on that. Actually, the bee community is much better about providing their own good neighbor policies, and that there was a lot more consistency in the bee world, urban beekeeping, than on these other topics, to be honest.
I
So
believe it. I believe it.
that was easy. That was the easy one.
I was pleased to see the slaughtering. We did have a couple issues down South Troy. where there was slaughtering of chickens
Okay.
and other animals. So I was pleased to see that put in.
Okay, great. All right, so just finishing this up, alternate transportation, using more transit, recognizing where you have transit, rapid bus routes. We did take that into consideration. We are trying to discourage proliferation of new surface parking lots, which competes with good infill development. So using those surface lots more judiciously. And then if you are going to have new surface parking lots, requiring some bike parking and EV charging stations as well. And also just encouraging developers to use the transit programs that exist for their tenants and bike share programs and things like that. So we do incorporate some of those things in here in how we looked at and how the code develops. And then lastly, just on this preliminary stuff, the way this will affect existing permits and land uses going forward. Permits approved prior to the effective date of the new law will remain in effect. So whatever you got approved for, you can move forward with. Legal uses that were allowed under the existing code, if there are some things that we zoned out, to be honest, I don't think we did too much of that, but there are probably a few folks that have been zoned out. Whether they were allowed as of right or with a special use permit, they are allowed to continue to exist. They are grandfathered non-conforming uses going forward. That carries with the land. They can sell their property, their business, whatever their use to somebody else, and that grandfathering status carries with that property. You have probably a lot of non-conforming uses that existed from when the original code was updated that have carried forward all these years. Those continue to be grandfathered legal non-conforming uses as well.
Monica?
Yes.
I definitely want to hit on cannabis, and I'm sure other members do also. But I did want to ask you, I started reading signage, and I'm wondering, only because I know in different sections of the city, maybe there's different sign, in terms of height, et cetera.
Right.
What I'd like to see, especially like Hoosick Street and, some of the residential, even in the downtown, just more of a template for signage throughout the city. I do know, like down Dutchess County, they have like a Greenway toolkit where they actually hold developers accountable when they initially come into the planning board. This is going to be the height of your sign. You're going to put so much shrubbage. We wouldn't see that all along Hoosick. Like you said, obviously they'd be grandfathered in, but is there a way to really temper down just the gateways of our city with signage, et cetera? And did you look at that at all?
We definitely looked at how your signage, your signage is quite funky, to be honest, right now, the way that works. Because it's all driven by the size of letters, except that your sign can be much larger,
Right.
and your letters have to be tiny. So we eliminated that. And so in doing that, though, you're kind of taking a step back from all of it and looking at what you've got. I would not say that we were drastic in our rein in of size. I do feel like we tried to right size the signage for different districts where the scale and where things change to make sure that it was more compatible. It's hard to go by your current code because it was so driven by other things that I can't say how much it differs in that regard. But in terms of Hoosick Street, we really did try to look at making sure that going forward that gets treated a bit differently, recognizing though that that plaza, there's a certain amount of that has to, but we put a whole new section in related to how that all should be treated going forward, because you didn't actually have anything on it. Um,
That's how
yeah.
McDonald's, there was a huge battle. I wasn't on the council then, but I recall Councilmember Bodnar, and there was a huge battle from the residents because McDonald's wanted to put their traditional huge
Mhm.
sign. They did scale it down eventually. But then across the street, you got Speedway, you got the huge,
Right.
gawky sign. I get the plaza, but going east on Husick, I would love to see more, like, if you drive down Rhinebeck and places like that, in terms of,
Mhm.
more.
Yeah, we definitely
simpler,
reined in some
smaller.
of that, yes.
So,
I mean, I guess maybe take a look at it and, some of it you can probably get a feel for yourself, but I mean, I do feel like we did try to make that change over. And we did have two tools to work with, which I haven't gotten to showing you yet, but because we have two sets of districts, we could look at it from different perspectives and we actually picked the path that made most sense for the scale of what we thought we're seeing. So, we spent a lot of time on signs, so hopefully it may not be as prescriptive as you're thinking of, but I guess I would encourage you to take a look at it and see if,
I'll take
if
a
it
look.
sort of meets it.
Councilmember Min, thanks, Monica.
Returning to the grandfathering, if a land use activity is basically becomes non-conforming because of the change in use, and then that business, I'm thinking about adult use in particular, looking at the zoning. If that business were to leave that location, I assume that a new business that does a similar land use you couldn't bring a new business in that doesn't conform with the zoning.
So there's a 12-month, so within 12 months, that building could be replaced with another adult use.
So that's the window, a year
It's a year.
year window, and then after that, it will revert to the new plan.
Correct. Once that discontinuation, and we did try to make sure we buttoned up some loopholes that can exist with that non-conforming, or, that discontinuation can be played with, frankly, by property owners. And so we did try to button up some loopholes because we've been doing this long enough to realize that those exist. But yes, if you discontinued for 12 months, then it would need to revert to something that's conforming. Within that window, though, if it is legitimately carrying forward for a certain amount of time in that 12 months, then that could be replaced.
Thank you.
I know, real quick on that, Monica, Councilmember Soriento and I were discussing the adult use, we'll say venues, last evening. Maybe it's a perfect time for you to ask.
So I've noticed here that for Industrial Parkway, that's
Yes, yep.
so that could also be used for adult use, but there's homes. I mean, it's also a residential neighborhood up
Right.
up on the top of the hill there. I mean, wouldn't that conflict with this?
We have to pick somewhere. So, we do have to allow them somewhere in the city. So we picked, I mean, to be honest, adult uses are often put in industrial zones.
It's surrounded by neighborhoods, so I mean,
Yeah.
even the Country Gardens is literally right across
That's true.
right
Yeah.
there, and then there's a school.
Right.
The school is right there also.
So, but that, isn't that business development? It's not industrial, is it?
It's not allowed there. It's allowed in community, commercial, and industrial, and that's business development.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I was,
It is.
And, like I say, you have to allow them somewhere, or they can be pretty much anywhere.
Okay.
And they all require special use permits. So there's opportunity.
Councilmember?
Sorry.
You could,
but we do, and there are also other restrictions, like there can't be more than one within so many feet of a residence, schools, churches, parks. there's a buffer, there's a whole section with additional regulations of those. There also, I believe, there might even be a distance. So there's a buffer distance from any of those uses. And in addition to that, I think there might even be a buffer distance between those uses. So there are other things that will rein in, you know, even within the districts that they're allowed in, they're not just allowed anywhere in those districts. So, yeah, so I mean, you know, you guys get to decide where to go and how far we want to take. We can't zone them out. So we do have to provide a placement, and you can't isolate it to like one lot and call it. That's been tried and has gone down
I
in
was
flames.
telling Councilmember Sorrento.
Yeah,
last
so we
night.
actually run buffer tools to figure out what that buffer distance is. For instance, we started at a larger distance between a bigger buffer. And then once you start running the tool around parks and churches and residences and everything, you find yourself, you know, leaving nothing open. So then you take out something to see if, okay, what does that keep? So, and I apologize, right off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what all of our regs say, but we do definitely have buffers from schools, churches, and parks. And on the residential, I'm not actually sure on that because I think we were running out of places once we ran the buffer tool around a residence. But so I'm not sure if that has a buffer or just no adjacency, or so I wondered about that because I think we almost couldn't find a place for them once we did that. There's just simply, Troy's just too mixed use, which is how they end up in industrial districts, because it's the one place you might be able to get one in that doesn't, you know, and you can't go crazy with the tools.
I'm curious. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm just curious. What kinds of uses are you seeing? Could you be more explicit?
In terms of adult use.
Is it juice bars, topless bars, sales?
And I can answer that. Since I've been here, I can count on one finger the amount of times I've been asked about these uses.
Yeah.
It's not like it used to
Yeah.
be with, you know, with the internet and everything. They don't come up like they used
Right.
to. And certainly live entertainment would be different, but we don't get that many.
No,
question.
and I really haven't heard of a desire. I think it was just more, you know, you saw a red flag and just had to ask. I think more hot to try, but Councilmember Conley Wilson, I really want to talk cannabis and hookah and all that good stuff. Councilmember Conley Wilson.
The committee, there we go. Thank you. You mentioned like these buffer zones. Would you be able to provide the council those kinds of maps when it comes to like these like adult uses and marijuana and all that?
So we do have the maps for the adult uses.
Mhm.
For cannabis, we didn't do the buffer. There are, the new New York State law has buffers that are required for schools and churches, not parks, but then you can't advertise within another X number of feet of parks, churches, or schools. So that will probably preclude some businesses because they just won't be able to properly advertise. We do have some, a little bit of additional standard beyond the state regs in this code update, but we did not run that tool. We could do that for you to see, you know, what, you know.
Yeah, I'm just more curious about like where these things can actually live, if we're like restricting them, just to make sure that that is actually feasible for business owners that
Right.
want to
Yeah.
go into those kinds of
Yep.
businesses.
Definitely. I think on the cannabis, we can go back to that, but we went mostly with what the state reflects. So regardless of whether they can live there or not, really what becomes only within your purview is the districts as a whole. You know, so you could pick more districts if you felt like, well, with these state regs, we can't really fit much of anything. That would be within your purview, but obviously you can't go below what the state is allowing. We did, I think, have one provision that certainly if you guys felt like it was not leaving enough locations, that could be certainly relooked at. Yep.
Okay. And, you know, with cannabis, there's growing, there's retail, and then I have semi been educated, there's a whole testing.
Right.
We've been approached, full disclosure, but nothing in the works whatsoever, but about testing
Mhm.
cannabis, which is a whole other, you know, business.
Right. Yep. I actually think there's like 9 different actually siloed different types of uses. And the state is looking for those businesses to be separate. They're separate licenses. They are looking to generate small businesses and not have mega cannabis operations that are, soup to nuts.
Change.
So, and of course, your ability to regulate things really is more with the retail and dispensary, not so much with, the growing and the processing. That is more to be treated like any other agriculture and lab
Mhm.
industry. Certainly the same reasons you might not allow processing of something else because of noise, dust, and whatever would apply here, but you can't just treat them differently just because it's cannabis. So the state's
Yeah.
kind of been clear on that so far, which is why you guys were only given the option of opting out of retail and dispensing and on-site consumption as opposed to the other functions.
Yep. What about, I did notice the indoor shooting range. Where'd
Yeah.
that come from? Is that just,
Just trying to cover all the uses.
gotcha. I saw it industrial.
Yes.
Correct.
Our thought was you could see something like that in an old warehouse or something of that isn't typically, but obviously if you don't want to, they're not a protected use. If you do not want to have one, that is your right.
Yep. You're honestly, your time and energy and research, really very, very impressive.
Oh, thank you.
Collective
Collective effort.
Anything you want about these.
Right.
Oh,
Not
believe
too
me,
much, not quite
yeah.
everything.
It's a whole world out there I was unaware of. Yep. Councilmember Min, did you have a question?
Oh, I can go back.
Did, although if you want to flow more through the presentation, it's just use districts for sorority and fraternity houses. So if you just want to
so,
put a
yeah,
pin in
can I-
that.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so very briefly, your traditional zoning code has a land use, a zoning district map. It looks a lot like a map like this would look. Your current code has 21 districts and some overlays and a variety of things. We have reduced this to 13 districts, 1 overlay. And so we found a lot of your districts were just kind of repetition of almost all the same things, except like 1 thing would be different or 2 things. So we really tried to reduce those numbers. We also created a whole nother framework with another map that allowed us to really reduce these numbers because this map only deals with uses. It does not, like your current code, also try to work all of the lot development standards into the district. So those have actually been separated from each other, use from scale and lot development. And I'll talk about the other in a second. So you'll have a land use map, a use districts map that looks like this. And honestly, we generally reflected a lot of what you have today. We weren't looking to reinvent the wheel. You're mostly built out. So we wanted to allow what's working. And then mostly we looked at what just is falling through the cracks and not even in your code. There's a whole bunch of uses that don't even make your list of uses. They either weren't thought of back then or they just haven't ever made it into any version of your code. So your list of uses is much longer, but that's because we also tried to capture more things. And then where there's like things, and I'll show you on this chart, the use table that you have in front of you, where things are very similar. Bakeries and banks or bakeries and florists and small retail shops do not all need to be treated differently. We just call them retail. And service businesses that are all very similar that don't have anything unique about them or impactful, they'll fall under a general service category now, which eliminates having to list out all those uses as well. So while this list is longer, it actually groups some things together more. It's in your code currently. This is a really important user-friendly feature of your new code because it's all in a table as opposed to your current code, if you've ever used it, where it's lists after lists and then see the previous district, and then you have to flip 5 pages back and read that list. So this puts everything synthesized onto one table. You have the use districts across the top, all the uses along the side, and then the far right column is a note about additional regulations. And we were just talking about agriculture, cannabis, adult uses. This is a cross-reference to let somebody know that there's additional regulations for some uses, and then you can just flip to that section. This is an important thing because people think, oh, I'm allowed.
And we can use this.
And that's the map that goes with that, yes. So this should be a lot easier to use than what you're currently used to, and gives people a heads up about some additional regulations right off the bat so they don't get caught by surprise. Because codes have a lot of embedded additional little nuggets in there, and this helps to tease those out. So that's how this table works. And then the other aspect of this is building lot standards and building form. And so that used to be all synthesized into districts and try to work together. We separated those. And, you know, this is an area where zoning has changed a lot in the last 20 to 30 years. So a lot more attention to form and how lots function and buildings function with the public realm, paying more attention to streetscapes and community character. Those things have changed a lot. Your code also is very suburban. So we had to just right size this for Troy.
Right.
So we have taken some of those modern tools, not all of them. There's a whole bunch of things out there that we don't think really would work in Troy because it is so built out. But we did try to take the good parts. So this code is much more detailed and focused on the block level as opposed to just running a broad brush across a use district, for instance. Your suburban code, not only does it create issues with just keeping your current character, your urban fabric, but it's very hard to do infill. So we really tried to focus on both things. The things we analyze in terms of neighborhoods, yes,
On that note,
yes.
I was scrolling through, maybe it's in your presentation. I did notice for new buildings, so many charging stations per so many square feet, maybe. Is that in your presentation?
it's
or could
the-
you talk about that?
I do have a slide on the EV charging
Okay.
station stuff. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
So the things we looked at were scale, density, changes in activity level. If you just look at these two slides, you know, these are clearly two very different densities and scales, you know, within the city. We also looked for recurring development patterns. It turns out Troy does have a lot of recurring themes. So that was actually really handy for us in how we ended up going about this. But obviously there's also unique scenarios. So you're trying to address those as well. And then lastly, of course, we're still trying to figure out when we're doing this, how to keep this as user-friendly as possible. So what we came up with was a second map. And this map deals with the lot development standards. So every parcel in the city is also coded for basically development character as well, not just land use. And we created 8 zones. We actually found we could reuse these zones in different parts of the city and that this would work fairly well. There were a couple of more unique things, and we did have to try to address them with their own types of zones. And we literally block by block coded the city, therefore, for the character and density and scale that is more present than the way your current code is written. So you'll use this map and the other map together. And so these, that second map that I just showed you deals with lot development flexibility, housing development flexibility, and that we allowed for more infill, building location standards, so you'll still have setback considerations. But it changes here because instead of the suburban setback standards with maximum, minimum setbacks, so you have to push the buildings to the back, we sort of flipped that on its head and said, really, you should be building more to the street. You should be allowed to fill out your property more. You should be able to do attached buildings in most of the city. And so we created a lot more flexibility based on what we were actually seeing from the traditional character. And so we really tried to make the density compatible with what was around it. And we also addressed things like accessory structures, where those should be located, where parking should be located. Even, you know, how much encroachment you can have if you're doing front stoops, encouraging front stoops and things like that as good elements, and allowing for them and just showing, you know, encouraging where those could be located. And so each of these zones has one of these 11 by 17 pages that pretty much provides illustrative standards for all of those things I just talked about, including setbacks, minimum setbacks, maximum setbacks, height, the amount of imperviousness, how much lot coverage you should have. All of those things where accessory structures should go are all on these sheets. And there is one sheet for each type of district. This is your least dense neighborhood. This is some of your like the Carroll Hill neighborhood with the capes and ranches, places like that. Some of your newer development falls into this category, newer housing development, single family home neighborhoods. And then, for instance, on another, here's downtown one, there's two downtown scales. This, obviously, everything you can see, the buildings jump in height, the build out of the lots increases, et cetera. So these are two examples of those sheets, but there are 8 of them and they apply to each one of those districts. So depending upon where the lot is, you can go to these and find out what your development standards would be.
Monica, the Brazilian waterfront in Flebris,
Yep.
what did you add or change? Was it dramatic based on the climate, et cetera?
Yep. We have a whole section on that.
Awesome. So where would that be in here? No.
Off the top of my head, let me see.
Council President, I just have a question about intensity.
If you don't mind using the mic. ask them.
Council President.
After you find that, council member, Article 6.
285.
And we can explain that one.
Okay.
Going along with this, we did also put some architectural design standards.
Council member Manda.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I actually had a
Oh, yeah.
I think because we're working off an older draft, Downtown Edge is the equivalent of Downtown 2, Downtown
Yes,
Center.
that is where those tweakings that I talked about with the heights caused us to have to relook at all of this.
Yep.
And actually Edge became core and core became Edge, and we decided that that was going to really mess with people. So we renamed them Downtown 1 and 2.
The big drawing.
Great. Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, so that,
But
so.
there's still similar. Some
Yeah, so
downtown-
downtown 1 is now core. Is in the old version is core, more or less, and downtown Edge is downtown 2. Yep.
Thank you.
And I'm going to walk through how this all works in a second, but going along with those pages, we did also include architectural design guidelines and standards. A lot of what's in here are guidelines. They're not shalls, they're preferreds. That was intentional. It is very difficult to put together a comprehensive list of things you definitely, absolutely, under all circumstances want to see. So we do want to leave some flexibility for city staff and the planning commission, the historic commission, to look at things from their perspectives. But on the other hand, your code provides no guidance to speak of right now, except in the downtown. So it was sort of a missing piece for the rest of the city. And so we put together a series of recommended guidelines. Some things do say shall, and that means you have to follow it. It's not very many. But for the most part, this is a guiding document just to help everyone as they're looking at new projects, just try to get that compatibility with the kind of character you have in Troy. We did hear from the planning commission members that they do struggle with this aspect of things when they're looking at large projects because they really have no guiding document. And so I included a couple of those sheets in here, but there are, I think, 6 of them. But anyway, a lot of it is just to show illustrations of the ideas. But, this allows you to, this says, allows you to provide guidance without everything needing a variance, which is why preferred is often a better tool. And I do want to walk through how this would work. So I did provide a site example. This is the Price Chopper site in Lansingburg, which you're all familiar with. And so if you were thinking of buying the Price Chopper property and you wanted to see what you could do there, the way you would use this code to do that is, so this is, there are 2 lots there, and this is just the basics of those 2 lots. You would first go to the use table if you wanted to understand the uses that were permitted first, and you'd take a look at that table and you'd find that the Price Chopper site is in the waterfront mixed use district. And so then you would go to your use table and you could go down the 4 pages of uses and see that anything with a P is permitted. Anything with an SU is permitted with an approved special use permit, and that you probably will have to go for site plan review unless it's a 1 or 2 family home, but otherwise, here are all the uses that you're allowed to potentially do on that site. And again, there's those additional regulations on the side that some uses would require. So once you have a handle on that, you would go to the second map, and that would give you your blueprint for how much build out, how much height, what the setbacks would have to be.
The intensity.
Correct, the intensity map, right. So you'd look at that map and you'd see that it is in intensity zone 4, neighborhood 4. And then you would go to the neighborhood 4 sheet, and this would provide you with all the build out allowances for that. And these sheets do have an eye towards urban infill. So there are minimum heights. There are maximum setbacks in the neighborhood 4. So when you're looking at the Price Chopper site, you're going to find out that you would never be able to build that Price Chopper. That would never, under this new scenario, the building would need to be to the front, to the street. The parking would need to be in the back. It would need to be more than 1 story. You're looking at this site from a different perspective going forward based on the neighborhood 4. And so from there, the remaining piece would be those architectural guidelines. Once you knew what you wanted to build, you would present that, and that's when the Planning Commission and city staff would look at what you're proposing in terms of architecture and tell you whether or not it's compatible with the Lansingburg style, feel of what's around it, et cetera. From another perspective, what if you knew you were a multifamily housing developer? And so you're looking at it from that perspective. So the first thing you would do is look at the use chart, because you want a use table to see where multifamily is allowed in what districts. So you would then find that it's allowed in the multifamily, mixed use 1, mixed use 2, downtown mixed use, waterfront mixed use, campus institutional, and community commercial. So those would be your districts where you could do multifamily. And then you could use the use map to find those locations. If you knew that you were a larger scale multifamily housing development, you would then go to those neighborhood charts. You can go back to this one, for instance, and see where you could, at least like in the neighborhood 4, you can build a 4-story building. So you would want to be looking at those types of things then to see what level of height you could get. And then you go back to that map to see where like the neighborhood 4 or other districts that allowed larger scale buildings would be allowed, and those would be those locations.
This may seem like it's more complicated, but in reality, it takes the best of form-based design and doesn't sprinkle it throughout every page of the code, so you're constantly looking for the hidden gems. It makes it very explicit and sets a standard that we think Troy is worthy of.
I love it now that I understand how to go through the steps.
Right.
Like I feel like a 4th grader. I wrote down the steps. It's so simple once
Once you
know.
yeah. And the thing that is nice about this is we didn't have to treat those use districts, trying to fit these two things together. They aren't, single family home neighborhoods is a really good example actually, because you have two very different scales of single family neighborhoods and styles. And this allowed us to create one use district because that's the general use with some other compatible, institutional service uses, et cetera. Those are the types of things, those are permitted in all of those districts, but the scale and character is very different. So this allowed us to create, whereas some of the single family neighborhoods, the more urban neighborhoods are very similar to your two family neighborhoods. And they could be treated the same because that character is very similar. The difference is some of them are generally single family versus two family. So it's actually a fun tool to use once we sorted it out and figured this out. Lawrence and I have been doing zoning for a long time, and we're really proud of this aspect of this.
I'm
really proud.
Well, I was psyched after I met with you, but now I'm even more psyched because, what we want developers to recognize that, yes, we're friendly toward development, but at the same time, we want them to know ahead of time our wants, our needs, our character, our architecture. And the more information they have before coming into the door, the
That's
better
right.
it's going to be for development. If we can balance, the environment, balance the cultural, the waterfront, you name it. So the more tools that we give them, I see better and more smarter development. So
I agree with
that's,
that. Yeah.
And quick question, you mentioned setbacks and things like that. Do you actually go into detail? Like, say if I'm a developer, like I hate to use Dutchess County, but I really view their countywide planning model. It's just amazing. They literally went into detail in terms of the shrubbery, the landscaping, I should say. When a developer does come in, did you?
We do have
look into this?
we do have a landscaping section.
You do?
Mhm.
Okay, nice.
Yep, I will. I covered some of these things rather briefly because
It's
there's a lot to
fine,
cover,
yeah.
but I will give you the broad strokes. I do have a slide on that. But we do have landscaping in this as well.
Great.
Does anybody have any questions about how this works, or can I? Okay. All right. So as mentioned before, you do have these additional regulations. We added a bunch of additional regulations. You do have a bunch in your code now. So this tool is not new. We updated all of those as necessary. On the right side, you'll see a list of ones you have now. We added a bunch. Some of these things were just uses that weren't in your code that have come along over the years. Some of them, like you'll see cannabis on there, literally landed in our laps late in this process. So we've tried to keep up with those things. But those are all they're all cross-referenced. And so those are obviously important things to look at when you're considering this. And
I'm
they're
so
a whole article. So that's a whole article in the code that lists all these out in alphabetical order.
We had a huge problem with a doggy daycare that had opened. I think when I was skimming through last night, you addressed that, I believe.
So we do treat, we do address them as uses. We don't have, so we tried to put kennels in certain types of the more impactful of the doggy daycares. We did treat them a little bit differently because, an overnight kennel versus a vet
Right.
versus a daycare are not necessarily all similar.
So you distinguish that?
I believe they are
That
all
would be good.
distinguished.
I
That could
think
be-
that would be good.
I know we separated at least two of them.
Animal day.
Yes, animal
Gotcha.
daycare is its
Yes.
own line.
Okay.
So you should take a look at that to see where we allowed them, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it was just a huge, because it wasn't addressed in our code.
Yeah.
Remember that, Steve? There was a big issue. So, yeah.
All right, well, it's in there now.
Nice. This is really awesome. Really awesome.
So in the spirit of time, you're not going to go through all these different additional regs, but I would encourage you to look at those because there are some, devil in the details, so to speak. And then there's the other types of additional regulations.
Monica, I apologize.
Yes,
If
no
we
problem.
want to change a devil in the detail, can we give you a buzz, talk to you,
Oh, yeah.
Steve and
Mhm.
Lawrence, and try to find? like-
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
So the other kinds of supplemental regulations are the off-street parking, fencing, landscaping, lighting, those types of things. So we did address all of those as well. You have some of them in your code now. Some of them got changed quite a bit, like we talked about signage already. Some of them we just enhanced because they were frankly rather weak. And some of them were in pretty good shape. So I'm gonna just quickly walk through some of the highlights on these. Off-street parking was an area where we did change things considerably. The movement in planning and zoning in the more progressive, cool cities is to move away from the automatic requirement of off-street parking for all uses. You did not require parking in your downtown, but you generally required it otherwise. Most of those parking standards that everybody has in their codes are fairly, not that they're not arbitrary, they were based on some science at some time. They've been replicated over and over again, tweaked slightly, but everybody's been using them and it actually has led to over parking in general. So over time, this has been drifting in the other direction. And there's been a lot of study about how much over parking there is. There's also the general issue of if you don't need parking, this requirement leads to a lot of variance requests because you've got this arbitrary number and developers feel they don't need that many. It's a small project. They have to come for a variance. You were seeing a ton of parking variances. So one of the charges we were given by the city was let's really overhaul parking. So we took a page out of a couple different codes. Buffalo actually in 2016 eliminated parking as an automatic requirement across the city. And a few other cities have done the same in the Northeast to varying degrees. We tried to take the best of those elements and try it in Troy. So what we've said is there's no.
How did they deal with it then if they didn't require?
You're going to find out.
All right. I'm very nervous about this one.
So we took this from the premise of there is no arbitrary, definitely required number of off-street parking spaces for any particular project. So we just eliminated that from the equation. We treated small projects where potentially you don't need any parking. Anything over a single family home with, off the top of my head, a certain number of bedrooms, because you have so many college scenarios here. We didn't want to base it on units. We based it on bedrooms. You don't need to have parking, period. After you get to a two family and a certain number of bedrooms, you do have to provide a parking plan with whatever you're proposing to do. In that parking plan, you're going to justify why you either want parking or don't want parking, or how many spaces you want as part of that project. If you're on a bus line and you feel like the project that you're doing doesn't require parking, or you already have one spot where there's a demonstration that there's ample parking in that neighborhood, perhaps no parking is necessary, you make your case. And when the planning commission is doing site plan review, you don't have to have parking. That parking requirement is not there. If you're a
Quick
larger
question.
yes,
Do you see that being more subjective though?
it's definitely more subjective to a certain extent, for sure. Let me just walk through it and then larger projects, once you hit a certain threshold, you have to do a larger scale parking plan as part of your project, which you should be doing anyway as a good developer, but we're requiring it. And there are certain things you're going to have to provide in terms of trip generation, all the things they're supposed to be looking at anyway when they're trying to decide how much parking they need. Trip generation, what other parking opportunities there are, looking at shared parking, looking at alternatives to surface parking lots versus structured parking. Whether or not there are city public lots, if you're a retailer, should you need to have a parking lot when there's a city parking lot that's fully available right around the corner? Things like that. You have to answer to all of that as part of your project. And those will be reviewed by city staff and a recommendation made to the planning commission as part of all project reviews. And then with that, we also included parking maximums. So we did cap the amount of parking that you can have fairly significantly. Capping parking has been going on for a long time. That was the first wave of there's too much surface parking lots. Communities started putting a maximum percentage of parking over the minimum that you could do. That's actually a long settled way to deal with it. What they're finding is that that still leaves all the arbitrary requirements for parking in place and does not lead to good projects ending up needing more variances or walking away because they don't want to provide the parking. So we did provide fairly strict parking caps. You can come for a variance, you know, if you want more parking, that is always a possibility. And if you want to have parking up to a certain amount more than the cap and you can justify it in your transportation management plan, that can be approved. Once you get over a certain amount though, you would need to get a variance essentially to provide that. For the larger scale projects though, the whole parking component will be a major part of the project. You're going to need to answer to it one way or the other. So it's not like you're escaping parking. You may want more parking than the city wants you as a developer, than the city really wants you to put in place. You may want a nice large surface parking lot and the city planning commission may say, we don't think you need all that parking. And you could be denied on that. Senior housing is a very good example. Most codes require all these senior parking spaces for a whole bunch of people that don't drive. So this is definitely a change. We are not the first to do this. In fact, and we did try to make it a scalable situation. So smaller projects, it might be a very easy question. Larger projects, they're going to have to do their homework. They should do their homework anyway, because they really should they should want to understand how much parking they really need. We're in places where the parking in downtown, where there's less places to park, you know, chances are most developers are only putting in the parking they need because those properties are a premium. Where it becomes less of an issue is Lansingburg and South Troy, some parts of South Troy, places where you would find developers still may want to overpark. If there are existing lots, nothing in this says you can't use those existing lots. So, you know, existing lots, those can stay existing lots. No one is saying you're not capped on using your existing parking lots. And we do have also in the parking section, a more enhanced section on how surface parking lots need to function. There's landscaping requirements, some screening requirements. And then in addition to, you know, so if you want to do a surface parking lot, the Planning Commission now has a lot more tools of what that should look like. And we did right size the parking spaces and aisle drives to be a more urban configuration. That was reviewed by the city engineer, so he felt very comfortable with how those were working. We provided for, if you do want to do a surface lot, we did provide that you provide bike parking and EV charging station, a certain percentage for parking lots over a certain size. If you're only doing 4 spaces, 2, 3, 4 spaces, we did not require bike parking or EV charging stations for those situations. The bike parking kicks in at 5 spaces. The EV charging station kicks in at 20 spaces, recognizing that those are expensive endeavors, the charging stations. And we actually did include a component about long-term bike parking, which are more the overnight bike parking that we're trying to encourage for new development. That is not across the board. We did look at uses that really are more realistically going to want bike parking and didn't just arbitrarily, like some codes require long-term bike parking for all kinds of people that aren't going to ride bikes. So we were more practical about that than if you were looking at some of the other model codes in the Northeast that have done some of that. I will say on the bike parking, I felt like we were a little more practical. Some of that went well beyond what we've done. We also didn't see any need to.
Monica,
Yes.
one sec,
Yeah.
council members.
Oh, sorry.
I don't want to interrupt your
Sure.
flow, though. My district borders, includes RPI, and there are a lot of single-family homes that are indeed rented out. The bedrooms are rented out.
Yep.
We have a situation where an entire backyard has become a parking lot. To what extent will these regulations govern that?
So the student housing situation is a tricky one because what the code allows versus what's potentially going on in terms of how many people are living in the buildings. Zoning can only take care of so much of that, what's driving that situation. So that's why we did bedrooms versus units, because 2 units could have 10 kids with 10 cars. So that's why we didn't let single family or 2-family homes that are off the hook on the parking consideration past a certain number of bedrooms. But there's nothing that we no longer say a dwelling unit requires 1.5 parking spaces or 2 parking spaces like the current code says, which is just this arbitrary number once again, which has no bearing on the 7 kids that are living in that single family home. So they will need to answer to a parking plan, but we haven't set like a minimum that will go with each of those bedrooms, but they will have to answer to it if they're. Now, having said that, if it exists today, some of these situations are just going to be grandfathered. Again, this code only kicks in for now, but if there's a conversion or new scenario within those buildings, this applies. This will apply.
And could you,
If it's legal.
Oh, yeah, if they're legal.
Parking might not be legal right now.
Right.
They fill the backyard with cars, that's not a permitted situation, and that's an enforcement question under the current code as well as under.
right, true. And then could you just clarify what constitutes a rooming house, boarding house, as opposed to a single-family home that every bedroom is rented out to 1 and 2 students?
Right. So technically, I mean, in my opinion, those situations, there's definitions in there, but if you are renting out a room and use a common kitchen, et cetera, you are essentially a rooming house. And so those are not permitted in every district. Correct.
So we have, again, understanding the grandfathering, but we have in our little island here of single-family homes.
I don't know that your current code allows those.
But we have,
I'm just saying, like, I don't think they are.
four rooming houses then, if that, and according to this, they're not allowed in single-family, 2-family.
Right.
So they would.
Right. And it's not necessarily different in your current code. It's just it can be a very difficult thing to enforce.
But it also might be easier to enforce, wasn't legal, or it's still not legal now, and the current code, it'll be easier to enforce because of the clarity of this code.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to just keep moving here on some of these supplemental regs. So we talked about signage. We did completely overhaul the signage section. So when you look at
Monica, I
that,
apologize.
yes.
Steve, how do you see it working? A developer comes in, say they're turning a 2-family into, or say a 4-unit house into more apartments, et cetera. Will they have a form that they would fill out first in terms of parking? Or how do you see that kind of flowing?
I mean, that's going to depend on the district. I mean, if it's a multifamily district, then they're gonna need to come before the planning commission. And that's when that would kick in the, all the reviews we do, the complete streets review, the parking plan that would be on on that. So it's, if it's in a multifamily district, then that's the process it would go through. They're trying to add bedrooms to a single family, then we're gonna look at the number of rooms. Yeah, then we're gonna look at the number of rooms and the parking, and it's all gonna be tied to how much impervious surface you have as well. So can you create the parking you need? So, I mean, each one's unique.
And I agree. I mean, when I look at the zoning agenda, there's multiple requests for variances for
Right.
off-street parking. And 9 out of 10, they're granting it. So
And many of them are, and many of them are just easy to grant. Many of them are, you have it's hard to say. Many of them, you have the off-street parking that exists, and you have a two-family house in a downtown with no parking. A lot of times it just makes sense to do those. And there's no good guidance on it.
The goal to avoid chairs in the street, like many years ago. We all know what happened with chairs in the street.
I just want to add that this might sound a little vague right now, but the code does provide a very clear table, depending on the district you're in, depending on the use you have, when you need to prepare either a parking plan or a transportation demand management plan, and what needs to be in those plans. So yes, there is some subjectivity to it, but there are clear standards about what information needs to be provided to allow the staff and the commission to make these determinations with support. So it's not just, oh, this is what we feel like today.
Right.
That can't happen because that's a problem legally,
Yeah.
right? But we've laid out a process that's going to be followed. And if that process is followed repeatedly, then there'll be a precedent set on how each situation is determined. And
That's
there's
good.
clear guidance as to what's required for the people coming in the door to prove that they do or they don't need parking.
That's good.
Council
Thank
President.
you. Councilmember Min.
So in dealing with high density parking demand downtown in particular, one of the things that has come up repeatedly from residents is wanting a residential permit parking system, which does require us to go to the state and get that permission. Obviously not a tomorrow thing. Are there any things that you can see that integrate with our changing code that would either affect a timing, or there will be a limited number of street parking permits available? And if we're adding high density, are there things to that we should like trigger us that would need to be thought of in this code change? I know it's a mushy question. Mushy, man.
That's one way to put it.
So one thing to keep in mind is we're not discouraging structured parking. So anybody that wants to do a structured parking garage, as part of a project, they can have at it. We have some standards about structured parking, but for the most part, this is more about surface parking lots that we're looking to get that more in hand based on what's actually going on, as opposed to arbitrary numbers on either the developer side or the code side. In terms of for downtown, right now, downtown does not require parking anyway. So that's already what we're doing here actually will improve the question of parking for projects in downtown because there's no parking requirement in the B4 or whatever the district is. The planning commission right now is not in a good place to require parking, actually.
Mhm.
This requires it to be looked at. So projects that might be getting through today or without the right amount of parking will be held to provide the answers that the current code doesn't require. That's unique to downtown. The rest of the city does have a parking requirements. But in terms of, the permitting process outside of that, I can't think of anything that the code would drive other than, making sure that when that is looked at, you're also looking at where are the BRT, the bus rapid transit lines, where do you have your municipal, the city parking lots, just looking at all the parking infrastructure that you have to figure out, where those are most needed. But I'm not sure that this code would inform that ahead of time. Yeah.
CDTC is, right now, we're working with them to develop a smart cities toolkit. And parking is a big part, parking demand management is a big part of moving to smart cities. So where you would have previously had to display an icon on it knows you belong there because it can see your license plate. It also tells you where there's a parking place. And you worry about people looking at their phones, but so there are things coming and things on the horizon, and Troy is actually a great place to test it because the technology will come out of places like RPI and it needs to be piloted. So that should be coming out in the next month or so. So that's another resource that can be made available.
So I'm that may actually be the workaround that we need so that we don't have to go to the state. And I would love to talk to you in obsessive detail about that.
And yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, this is a living, breathing document. As soon as it's adopted, we're going to find things that are wrong with it. I'm going to be coming back to you with changes. You can't look at 14,000 tax parcels and get them all right. And as things change, this document can change.
And we need to make sure, the council, that we're relaying that this is not going to be perfect, but we'll get there. Because we are going to find probably some challenges
sure, yeah.
as we go along.
You'll change it more frequently.
Accordingly.
Than every 4 years.
Exactly, exactly.
Hopefully.
Now, Margaret, this is
okay.
amazing. It really is, really
I don't get
amazing.
any credit.
I know Steve's informing me
Yes.
that you have another group
I
coming in.
know,
Okay,
yes.
so I'm gonna, and
Please.
we're happy to meet again with you guys, but
Cool.
if you'd like. But so signage, we talked about a bit. There's a whole section on that. I encourage you to look at that to see, the changing scale, how I believe we used the use map as our guiding document. We tried it both ways and we decided that was more in keeping. So we use that tool as your, look at, you'll be looking at that for the signage sections and you'll see how the scale changes depending upon where you are.
Don't tell me, Steve, where are we with our signage? The monies that we got like 4 or 5 years ago.
The wayfinding?
Yeah, wayfinding. I'm sorry, I gotta ask. I'm so sorry.
That's a meeting in itself. It came in way over budget than what we had available. So we're actually applying right now, going through the DRI, trying to get some wayfinding through that process. But
Okay.
you'll be hearing more about it.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Carmela, you had brought up landscaping and buffering. We do have a whole section on that as well. We did beef that up considerably. You had some big references without any real guidance. So I don't know if this brings it to your Dutchess County standard, but we do have a section on landscaping and screening. We do require developers to provide that. This is John Ray and Sons down here in the corner in this picture where, their landscaping makes a whole lot of difference on that site. That's a really good example, I believe, in the city. So I like to use that example. But anyway, so you should check that out. But we tried to make, again, a practical, make it somewhat practical, not too prescriptive, but at the same time, if we don't provide some nitty gritty tools, it's really hard for the planning commission to sit there and decide what landscaping constitutes if we don't provide the information. So we tried to balance those things, provide some tools while also allowing for them to come through with it. And there is the ability, if a developer comes through with something that's different but is good, the planning commission, there is a waiver provision because we can't think of everything. Outdoor lighting, you do have some standards now. We did update that for, light pollution but we also do recognize that lighting and streetscapes is a safety matter. And so actually lighting is important. So there's actually some provision for like required parking or required lighting, but also recognizing energy efficiency, turning things off when they don't need to be on. So there's a whole beefed up section on outdoor lighting and some standards for the design so that when new fixtures are going in by developers in a neighborhood where there's already a lighting pattern, that they use the same architectural detail for those lightings that are already in place so that it's not a mishmash and things like that. So more pedestrian scale, et cetera. There's a small section on pedestrian linkages and placemaking elements. This is one of those areas that's tricky because it does get into the public realm of infrastructure as well. So you sort of walk a fine line there. But we do require pedestrian connections for new development to sidewalks from the the project to get to sidewalks, to get to the public infrastructure, things like that. And the placemaking element portion of it is asking developers, not requiring them, but add those unique features to your property.
I like this. I like
Recognizing that we can't necessarily make them do things in the public realm.
this is
So,
really key. It's really good.
hopefully it will work, it's going to be one of those give and takes, of course. But we did want to make sure we included it. There's a whole bunch of protection standards for shoreline, river protection. Not so much standards that aren't all that much out of line with what DEC requires anyway, but we did include them in here. There are some steep slope requirements, for instance, building into the steep slopes, stream bank protection. Like we mentioned earlier, we did upgrade the stormwater management standards to be about urban development as opposed to disturbing an acre, which an acre of land is a lot in Troy. So we kicked that in at a more urban scale, which is sort of a bit of the movement and what was recommended by our flood and our engineer on our team. And we included impervious surface standards rather than just building coverage, because obviously a parking lot is, not much more impervious than a rooftop. So we do have standards related to that. Green infrastructure is also included, low impact development. So there are some standards. Definitely encourage you to check those out. And then finally, our flood risk, Carmel, you brought this up. So we do have a waterfront overlay. It kind of covers two things in one shot because the overlay work together, not because they're necessarily all integrated. So we do have standards that just deal with where development along the Hudson River should be located in terms of setbacks from the waterfront, maintaining riparian buffers and things like that, or bringing back buffers where there aren't any right now. Also recognizing, though, you have the hardscape shoreline of South Troy, so there's different characteristics on the waterfront, which we did recognize. We also wanted to make sure we allowed for those unique uses that are waterfront dependent or waterfront enhanced that you wouldn't necessarily want to include everywhere else in the code that we just addressed in this section. Things like docks and marinas and things like that. We do allow for all of those things. We do allow for restaurants, et cetera, to have waterfront patios, those types of things. We did include an important thing related to waterfront multi-use trail, trying to get that river trail built out, getting developers to work with you again. But also recognizing, again, this is one of those public versus private things. So we do have a tool that is an incentive for an additional, essentially an additional story height. If you're on the waterfront and you are, and you do agree to build out on your part of that waterfront development, the waterfront trail segment, not just turn over an easement, but actually participate in the activity, you'd be
Actually
given,
help build.
right, you get a
trail,
bonus
yes.
story to your development potential if you want that.
That's exactly.
Trying to leverage
yes.
it, knowing that we can't require it.
Leverage is the key, but we have more leverage than I believe we've used.
Okay.
We have given up some valuable land in the past, not recognizing we have that leverage.
Yeah,
They want to work with us, but they're not going to do it if we don't use that leverage. I
Right.
mean, they're not going to do it out of the sheerness,
Right.
niceness of their heart, you know?
Right.
So where is that in here that I can?
So, no, I don't have it. You want to give me the citation? Oh, that's Article 6.
Article 6.
We found out something really interesting.
I know this,
Is it
Margaret,
the next page?
and
okay.
Margaret, I know this is your baby, the whole resiliency, all that, yeah.
It is. We've done a lot of work in this area, and well, you'll be glad to know that your zoning is newer than the flood maps that exist for Troy, which date from the 1970s.
I wrote down flood map.
There won't be new flood maps. There'll be digital data mapping, so there won't be surveyors out anymore. But the thing that we found was that in updating maps in the past, the Troy floodplain does not account for the Great Sacandaga Lake and the Conklinville Dam. It was just a big miss. And honestly, we were afraid that we were going to get numbers like have to be buildings have to be raised as much as in Schenectady, 16, 17 feet. Actually, you are okay for the moment. Yes, we think, but getting that math corrected, and it is up to a municipality to ask FEMA to map down. So I put that on somebody's list to do, because then you'll have a little more math behind this. But for the moment, based on what we can decipher, it's not a crisis situation. Now, Troy's stormwater management can fail to deal with a rain event. So it's not that flooding doesn't happen. It's just that right now the floodplain mapping wouldn't justify a lot of tools. But Monica will talk about what we did feel was appropriate.
Yeah, so basically-
I could spend an hour on this alone. This is good.
Well, so the
But
upshot
not
of it.
tonight, I'm sorry.
Well, so the upshot of it is your flood maps are not way off when you factor in climate change, which the new CARA Act that I mentioned earlier, that the state has put in place, requires you to factor in climate change and then set a new level of what that flood risk is. When we did that modeling, we found that because your floodplain maps might be actually a little generous, when you factor in climate change, it probably might bring you back to essentially where you are. But because the dam was not factored in, your levels are actually probably lower. And so that's what our flood expert, that's what we had him model. So that was the good news, in that we didn't feel like, oh geez, if we were to draw this with climate change, that's not what we found. We actually found that we're not far off. There were a few areas that are probably more flood prone, but not many. So we were able to use, so what we actually have created, this overlay, is the floodplain factored in for climate change. So it's, yeah, so it's not just, yeah, so that overlay factors in climate change. It's not just your floodplain, but when you look at your floodplain maps, and that's what flood insurance and everything is looking at right now, that's what the building code is looking at when they tell you what you have to build to. It's not much different. So what we're proposing in need of tools is actually fairly close to what you have to do in terms of building code in the floodplain anyway. But that's because of this probably miscued on the floodplain maps. So what we have done though is set the standard at what is the best practices going forward for actual flood risk, which does, instead of, and this is probably where the building code is going anyway, but the recommendation is really 1 additional foot above the 2 feet that's required anyway in the floodplain above base flood elevation. So the building code requires 2 feet. We're recommending that design elevation, once you factor everything in, really should be 3 feet if you're in this overlay for new development. We also address critical infrastructure, which is another key piece that everybody's looking at coming off of all these crazy flood events. And, and a lot of them are minimal streams that are doing immense damage, nothing as big as the Hudson.
Yeah.
More like the Post and Kill and the Wine and Skull. I live in West Sand Lake. I don't know if you saw those pictures from last July, but that part of the Wine and
I
Skull
was
that
there.
flooded, and Tig Lawrence lives up
Oh,
there
yeah.
too. That had never happened. Most of that is not in the floodplain, and the parts of the school that were up, that's the 500 foot or not even in the floodplain. So that's just the level of what, how much you have to rethink all of this.
I was at June Farms during
Oh.
that storm, and he had to drive me to the car in his quad. We couldn't get through.
Yeah.
It was unreal.
It was unreal.
It was
It was.
unreal.
It was a crazy day.
Yeah.
I was at town hall during all of that, and
Oh
because
my
I also
gosh.
work for the town, so I was there
Ah.
for, that was ground zero, because that's where it all
Okay.
came off of Tiggs Mountain and into town hall, literally into my office.
No way.
Yeah. Right. So basically what we did was we dealt also with critical infrastructure, and we did put standards in place about where that should be located and how it should be located out of the flood zone if possible. And if not, it needs to be built to a higher standard than just, again, the 2 feet. It had the critical infrastructure requirement by the state now, we're saying it should be another foot above that. But realistically, you should try to keep all critical infrastructure, and there's a long list of what that is, should really not be located in the floodplain. I mean, that's just should be the basic rule of thumb going forward. So that's all in the
We
code.
won't talk about.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about it.
Thought it's permit before it gets done.
So all of this is in there. This could have been put in your flood damage prevention overlay zone. There are other places in your code where this would fit, but we weren't updating that, and we were updating this. So we built it into this code, and it all flows with that overlay area. So you can take a closer look at that. But we do feel like we've really well positioned you going forward when the state asks what you're doing about this, and this is a state-funded project. You can say you hit a home run with this, we hope.
We could be a model.
You could be a model. This is my last slide. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, we did update all the permitting and review section. You had somehow eliminated your subdivision regulations over time. Not really sure what happened there. They're just not in your code anywhere. So we thought we'd bring those back so you could actually, I don't know, approve a subdivision. Legally.
Could not find it.
No, they're just not there. There's a chapter with nothing under it.
Yeah.
I found it.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was like that.
That was.
In his defense, it was like that for, yeah, I think a decade or so. But anyway, so we put those things back in. We did update all of your sections, you
I
know.
love that last one.
And I was going to say, the last bullet is important, just because it allows you to recoup money when that you've potentially had to spend dealing with, you know, properties. So, and also, right, so you cannot come and ask for something more until you've satisfied all your violations, your debts, your et cetera,
Yeah.
with the city before you ask for a new development permit to do something new with the money you have to do that. Right.
Okay, I'm going to ask for one thing I didn't hear, and thank you. Is there anything in here that say, I get the whole ADA compliance? Do we put anything on a developer to think differently in terms of handicap accessibility, in terms of amenities? For disabled folks, and I mean,
Outside the multimodal, you know, looking at mobility and from the perspective of getting to and from places without needing to, you know, in terms of
Right.
pathways and connections and things like that. Obviously, we have references to all the ADA requirements.
is there?
We did not take anything beyond that. I mean, the building code does at this point address a significant amount of things.
I'm even thinking. you
but,
know,
yes, I'm
when
wondering-
A developer, you know, says, take a school building, turns it into apartments, and yeah, it's ADA compliant, but then you go into the gym and there's nothing in that gym that would be
Oh, mhm.
accessible for, say, you know, a person that is disabled.
I see what you're saying. No, we didn't really hit on that. And I can look into that. I'm not,
Maybe see if
Sure,
other
yeah.
municipalities that, I hate to say Dutchess County,
yeah.
like, yeah, if you. can
We'll
at
look,
it,
yeah.
I'm just thinking like, I love the Academy Lots, and the first thing I did when I went in there, I'm thinking, this is gorgeous, but the gym has nothing. If I was disabled and, totally able to be independent,
Right.
obviously some folks who are disabled, they're not able to live independently, but there are many who are.
Right.
And, so maybe something to look at.
Yeah. Okay. We can check on that. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. This is amazing. I'm like so pumped. And honestly, Monica, you and Lawrence, amazing, amazing. And Margaret, well, so explain to me, Monica, are you subcontracted or are you with Margaret's firm?
River Street since 1999.
Really? Okay. and
She
is
did my
Lawrence-
zoning in Schenectady in 2004.
Really? Okay.
The two of them.
My first project at River Street was the South Brooklyn.
Oh, wow. Oh, my gosh. Okay. That's a long time. Yeah. You came back. Thank you. And Lawrence, are you with River Street or no?
No, I have my own law firm, I'm part of the consulting team.
Gotcha.
I work with a lot of it.
Margaret, just an incredible, honestly, this document could truly be a model and,
I think that's true. I think that's true.
no, might be. Once you turn, there it is.
I also want to really give credit to those lines for the staff that did the charrette in London Square as well.
Okay.
But in helping to envision the intensity zones and how those piece of those really created part of this. And to James White, son of Rick White, who you probably. know
Yeah.
for years.
Oh, my gosh. Okay.
He is extraordinary in his vision for London's.
That's
We're really
awesome.
happy with where we are right now, and hopefully we can stay there and not adjust that. But I just wanted to close by saying that Steve is 1,000% right, that the day after you adopt this, you'll say, oh, we should have. So you keep an annual list and periodically, make changes.
Yep.
Keep the zoning current. If it does nothing else, it enables your planning and zoning boards to act lawfully and to know what to do and to have guidance. And that makes development fair for everybody. And I think that's a big part of what a lot of the rest are trying to do. But thank you for the opportunity to do this code. We felt very strongly about it. And we appreciate it.
Well, and kudos and, what I want to see is more balanced development and not just giving away the store. Like I said, our waterfront, we have incredible potential. We've lost what we've lost, but now moving forward, we can incorporate, just obviously promenades and amenities that haven't been in the past and really hold developers just a little bit more accountable and be more of a partner. So this is awesome. I'm psyched, really psyched. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
sorry we
Appreciate it.
kept you so long. Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion, Councilmember Gully. Is there a second? Second, Councilmember Soriento. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you so much. Thank you. 2-minute break, hit the restroom, and then we'll go right into DS. And that'll be a 15-minute meeting, right, council member? This is awesome. This is awesome. But we need to go in depth, like, I'm not sure if you have yet, Like, take a look at running to the restroom.
I would walk on those heels. You could fall and get hurt. Go ahead. Are we on?
Yeah.
We are.
Well, yeah.
Oh, I didn't see ourselves. All right, thank you, everybody out there in social media land for joining us tonight for the general service meeting tonight. We're going to hear some information and concepts for a proposed barrel program in the city of Troy to move forward with trying to find a way to make a fair process for our garbage program. So with that, I'm going to take a roll call. Councilmember Steele. Councilmember Gully is here. In attendance also, we have Council President Carmela Mantello ex officio. We also have Councilmember Men. We have Councilmember Conley Wilson and Councilmember Soriento. We also have the honor of seating with Renee Panetta from our recycling department, Chuck Waiton, Commissioner of General Services, Tom Abbott, Director of Sanitation, and Andy Pedorowski, my favorite. Pedorowski today, he's leaving. I'm not giving him any respect. He's running away from us like a bad cold. Anyways, we're going to talk about that program. I don't want to waste anybody's time. It is late at night, so I will open it up to Renee. If there's anything that you would like to start with, I believe you want to open up the presentation with your slideshow. Okay, social media land, pay attention to the slides.
Thank you. Can you hear? Oh, yes, you can hear me. Sorry.
Okay, now.
So what we'd like to propose is for the council to consider the right size barrel plan. And in this, we've made several considerations so that it's an equalization process. All households with city collection will receive a barrel, and there'll be a determination made by residents as to what size barrel is appropriate for their household out of 3 sizes. This will happen in 2023 if council approves it. And the reason we're doing it is for convenience, improved efficiency, neighborhood cleanliness, and service. Those are goals I think that we can all be on board with. So the goal overall is for an equitable waste and recycling collection program throughout Troy for a cleaner Troy. So what we have found is that the most important thing we can do is reach out and communicate clearly, concisely, and completely. That way, there aren't a lot of questions after the fact. People are already invested in the process and the procedure before it happens. So in making decisions like this, it's really important that everybody has a seat at the table and that everybody has a voice in making the decisions. So there are a number of ways of looking at it. In the past, many practices have been to use people, planet, and profit. That doesn't necessarily take into consideration all of the other factors. So looking at it in terms of family, is this going to be good for our residents? Is this going to be good for their families? Will this have a positive impact on occupation, on people's businesses? Will it have a positive impact on the neighborhoods? And is there going to be a cost savings for both the residents and for the city? So we feel that offering a program such as this will answer all of those. So in going back to what I was saying earlier about the communication piece being concise and complete, we have a lot of different outreach alternatives that you've probably seen over the past, especially year since Naomi has joined our staff, making sure that we're having the same information available in many different manners so that somebody that doesn't have access to the internet can also have the same access as somebody who uses internet as their sole means of communication. So without reading through it and taking more time for everyone, there'll be a bunch of different social media opportunities, clearly marked barrels so that there will be stickers actually on the barrels, not just on the recycling, but also on the waste barrel. So if this program were to roll out, that right on the front of the waste barrels would be a required sticker saying, this is what goes in waste, and this is what stays out of your garbage can. That it will be done multilingual, so people would have access to multilingual documentation, stickers, etc. And that for landlords and tenants to be able to post in the building, even buildings that aren't participating in a barrel plan, so if they were large multi-unit apartments,
that they would have access to flyers and information that they can post in their properties. There's a source that we can get those from at no cost. So that would be an added value that would not be at any expense to us. Also reaching out by going to the neighborhood meetings, as many as possible. Most of you see us regularly at neighborhood meetings, so we would continue to do that. Also distributing in person. Many of the solid waste advisory board members do the door-to-door papering and would continue to help us do that, and doing mailings as well. So part of the consistent messaging, part of the consistent outreach and the communication piece is making sure that there are consistent standards that are messaged out to anybody. And so when the program starts, should it get approval, people would get an oops, and then they get a warning, and then they get a fine. So in a new program, it's not automatically going to receiving a fine immediately. That once the program rolls out, it would probably back down to the 2 steps, but that when it rolls out, so that there's time for everybody to adjust to it, that it would be giving you the 1, 2, 3 opportunity. So the determination on what size barrels people would select would be by determining what they can and will keep out of their garbage. We're really proud of this because this shows a reflection on how many things we're keeping out of the trash successfully now. And with more outreach and more communications with everyone, people will have the opportunity to take that much more out of their garbage. And this will help to determine what size garbage can they would need or want to have. So on deciding the barrel sizes, people would be able to right size it based on how much their trash their household produces. Also, in doing that, it allows them to have clear expectations set by us. So there are a number of ordinances that are not necessarily enforced completely now because there are so many different types of barrels and containers that people have. And it's hard to enforce when there isn't consistency of what people have access to. So I learned a new word in this whole process of discussing barrel sizes with different municipalities across the country. And I learned the word snow coning. And so snow coning means you're just setting your garbage right on top of your barrel. And that's a no-no. And so there are a number of ordinances that can address that and that do in municipalities that have barrel programs. Also, whether there's trash on the ground and if their lids are fully closed. So it really improves the neighborhood appearance by making sure that these standards are adhered to. We'll also make sure that people have additional recycling bins available. That's of course at no cost in the same manners that they're available now. So whether it's the sanitation team picking it up at the Department of Public Works or here at City Hall, people would have the ability to do that still.
Renee,
Yes.
may I stop and ask you a question? Would you prefer questions at the end?
Sure, absolutely.
Do you have any plans of enlarging the recycling bins? I know that the 32 gallon on the wheels at the Hamlet are very popular, not only with the people in the city, because I think then they can put it out once every 2 weeks, but it's also very popular with the workers because they're not spending their consistent day bending over down to pick up that barrel when they could have something that's right there that they can lift up. Is there any consideration towards that?
I would love to consider that. My speculation is that it would be a 2024 or 2025 project. That's something that there is funding through the recycling partnership, that they'll fund a percentage of each barrel, but because it would be supplying them citywide, and they're about 4.5 times the cost of the bins, that I think we need to ramp up to being able to provide that. So ultimately, I think that would be the goal that we would approach, but I certainly wouldn't ask for the funding of that simultaneously unless council decided unanimously that that's something that we're able to take on simultaneously.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, that would be the goal. Thank you. So the goal would be to have the barrels not have any cost to the residents and to not have a cost if the resident opted to downsize. So let's say that they started with the 64 gallon container and they were downsizing to the 32, then there would not be a charge for that. The municipalities that we've researched do have an upcharge. So if you had a 64 to start with, but then you've snow coned and you've gotten fines, and you need to upsize, there would be a $25 upsizing charge. So trying to manage those expenses for you. So fiscal questions would be addressed by Andy. Any
Sure.
questions?
Council President.
Yes, Renee, you mentioned other municipalities that you've looked at. What would be a comparable size of a municipality, indoor municipalities in New York State who have this?
In New York State, there weren't any that I researched personally that I felt had consistently good information. In New York State, Buffalo has a fantastic program. I got a lot of information from them. Clearly, they're larger than us. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, I've had some very extensive conversations. They've had a very successful program for a very long time. And so it's not so much the way that their model is designed, it's more so how their protocol is. And my last slide talks a little bit about some of the other opportunities and alternatives that we're going to use to make considerations as well. And based on what the last slide has, most municipalities, I was surprised to find out, do default to a 64 gallon for the most part. I've been under the understanding prior to that 96s were often the default. So I was pleased and really encouraged to hear that that was the case in many municipalities.
Sure.
Councilmember Soriento.
So can we go back to all right, so it says here, the resident cost for initial barrel. So let's say if I wanted to get the 96 gallon, is that a zero cost upfront?
That is the goal, and Andy will address that some more.
Okay. And if this gets passed, let's say, what's going to happen with everybody's barrels that we use right now? Where those won't be able to we can't utilize those, and where are they going to go?
So the city issued barrels would still get used if
Okay.
they are the city of Troy
Uh-huh.
barrels. The personal barrels would not. And so what we're encouraging people to do is if they want to set them out with their leaves in them so that they're not having the expense of having yard bags, that those can get used to put leaves in it. You can use them to make a backyard composter from, they can drill holes in it and use it for that. But the city provides, the city would provide the barrels, and then those who have the existing city barrels would continue to use them unless they were downsizing, in which case it would be a swap out.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay.
Renee,
Thank you.
Yes.
in thinking that, I'm visioning in my head that if we tell people, oh, keep your barrels and use them for leaves, we're gonna see garbage in them next week in a barrel. So, and I'm just saying that we have to have a way to educate in a proper way to get rid of them. I would like to say, hey, just leave your, if you want to get rid of your old barrels, we'll take it for free. Take them in, crush them up and recycle them. They're plastic, most of them. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, I just think that leaving them there in the hands of the owner is not going to clean up the situation in the alleys. It's going to add to it because now they'll have their city barrel, and they'll have their 3 other junk barrels out there, and we think they're going to throw leaves in there, but I would almost bet that a majority wouldn't. So I'd just be cautious to look at something in that area. Maybe there's a better process or something through, everybody talking that maybe we can figure out that might be better to do with those barrels than leave them in the hands of the owner. Because, again, an absentee landlord doesn't care. It's up
Right.
here.
Yep.
He's got the city barrels, paying that money, all pay that money. Now it's 3 other barrels there. The 3 families in the apartments, or 2 families in the apartments, they're gonna fill whatever they fill. If they send their kids out with the garbage, that kid's gonna look for the first open port for that bag. So I just think we need to think a little deeper on how we handle the bags and barrels that are consistently out there, that we want to eliminate them. We don't want to give them a second use or a second opportunity, because nobody's gonna take the barrel inside their yard and leave it out in the alley. We're still gonna have crappy looking alleys if we do. Just my opinion, and I could be wrong. I'm just envisioning this.
I think
I'd like
that's
you to
good
kinda-
wisdom.
I
Yeah.
like to kind of dig into that to think
Yep.
that what can we do differently to take those away and give them the one option, our city barrel. Thank you.
I
I'm
think
sorry.
that's a great option. I think because they are recyclable, that's something we could certainly have some sort of a campaign where we do a take back. So I think that's a great idea.
All right. Or just something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Make notes on it, everybody.
Chair.
Councilwoman Min.
And Renee, if
Yes.
you are getting to this, just tell me, because I can wait. So will households be limited to one barrel, or do they have the option of purchasing more than one barrel? Or being billed for more than one barrel?
Yes, they would have the option of being billed for more than one barrel. And
Oh.
so it would be billed based on the number of barrels used.
And then, because we have a lot of renters, we have a monthly cycle for our trash. I'm sure you are well aware, where the beginning of the month is everybody gets new furniture, apparently. And so what do you do when you have that 1 week of trash pickup where it's twice, 3 times what you normally would have? Are you gonna get fined every month? When you have people move in and out, because most of our housing is multifamily housing. So how are we gonna deal with that? You don't have to answer. If you don't have an answer, just think about it. And then do we have the trucks that have the ability to lift and dump the barrels? Because I spend a lot of money on replacement barrels every year, good ones, and they're about 75 to 80 bucks a barrel. And the lids are the first thing to go, even when zip tied on. And it's, it is what it is. That's like, sanitation guys. It's a tough job, and they're not always going to gently set my stuff down. And I understand that. But how are we going to keep that cost to the city down by not having to replace barrels whose lids are gone if we don't have sufficient trucks with the lifting?
How you doing? This is Tom Abbott, sanitation supervisor. That's a really good question. And one thing that I do know is the way we've talked about it in the past is residents would get an additional barrel. If they have a barrel that's full, garbage on top, garbage around it, garbage bags on the ground, there's a violation. So aside from the homeowner being able to make a phone call to the city of Troy for additional cans, the city of Troy could make that decision for them. Drop them off a bigger barrel, drop them off 2 barrels, whatever they need to adequately fit their garbage in the proper container. As far as our trucks go, all of our trucks right now, our garbage trucks are fitted with a rear tipper. We switched over to this particular rear tipper about 3 years ago, 0 maintenance. We've had nothing but success with this rear tipper. The newest truck comes with a double rear tipper, and all the trucks that we ordered for 2022 are coming with double rear tippers on them also. The reason why we go with the double rear tipper is because those trucks, we can't fit an automated truck through every alley. So we have to use rear loaders. So right now, in the future of this department, to continue using the rear tipper, and if this barrel service passes, it would be great for the department in general, the employees. There's a few gentlemen that work for the department that are a bit older. So sometimes there's a staffing situation where maybe a fellow's out for 2 or 3 days due to a back issue because he's picking up, 30, 40 gallons off the ground. This is a rollable tote, flip up the top, hooks up to the truck, dumps, and they roll it back. The guys love the idea of it. I love the idea of it. Our foreman of the department does too. This has been talked about for a few years now, and I think 2023 would be a great opportunity to implement it.
Chair.
Council President.
I guess, maybe I'll wait for all the slides to go through. Cost per unit, folks are paying, what, $219? What would folks pay per unit now? Is there a limit on how many barrels someone can get? Storage of the barrels. I mean, if I don't even, that's like least of my worries. But I guess, Andy, the big thing, cost comparison. And how is this going to minimize illegal dumping? And how would you quantify or qualify this different from pay as you throw, since it really is pay per barrel? So maybe talk about those things as you go along.
So questions about what the cost of the resin would be. I'm gonna put up 3 scenarios so you can see. It's a little complicated, so we'll get through this if that works, and then we'll talk what the cost is to the property owner.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you, Tom. In retrospect of that program being passed and given those new barrels, Councilperson Men had a great question on where the tops go. So my thought would we really try to stress to the workers that when they, because I know a lot of times when they take the barrels with the covers off, they just roll it back with the cover open. Could we maybe train them to maybe when they're done, just flip the cover up so it's not flopping there, and when a barrel doesn't drop, it doesn't land on the cover or tweak the hinge or break a hinge. If we just took the time when they drop it just to flip it back over, it would be less likely to break off if it's not, just flying off the side of the barrel in the wind.
Absolutely.
I know it's a little thing and probably a nuisance thing for the workers, but I think long-term it would keep the financial waste factor down when it comes to replacing barrels, because everybody's got a broken top. It's gonna say, my garbage guy did it.
And they're gonna want a new can, and they're gonna want a new can. And we're gonna have to remind
So see, we need to think about how if we're a little smarter in our progress and we just think about that, and I don't know, maybe we can have a conversation on this later, because I respect your opinions.
Yeah.
And let's see if that might be feasible to have our workers really enhance the way they put the barrel back, so we minimize the city's responsibility. And I hope these new trucks might have a camera on them, which would be nice. Then it shows everything, but.
They actually do have cameras on them. All the trucks now are coming in with the rear
Good. Oh,
camera.
that's good.
It's good for the driver, and it's also good for him to be able to watch the laborers.
Yeah.
What's going on in the back of the truck, because sometimes, let's face it, that driver can't really see what's going on in the back of the truck in some of those older.
Oh, that's great.
Older
I'm glad
trucks.
to hear that. Thank you.
So these barrels in particular, that are out now, the barrels that we use now, they are very durable. We upgraded this barrel 4 years ago from a cheaper barrel to a little bit more expensive, more durable barrel. Minimal problems with the barrel. One of the problems was in the wintertime, the automated truck, for instance, would place it onto the ground, and just the cold, weather-related issues, that barrel would just crack right up the center. So this is definitely, we've had a lot of good progress with the barrels, the recycling bins now. And also the employees being able to do the right thing by putting the barrel back and the lid up, because that issue came up a few months ago when material was blowing around from the residents having the lid up. And then obviously there was garbage in the top of the barrel that was blowing around, and they wanted to get that issue resolved. Then, so one of the issues was to just put the lid down. I think that this, a slide, one of Renee's slides here would rectify that situation with a violation of, the snow coning was a great, start to that, so.
And is that a $25 fine each time it occurs? I mean, does it ever escalate when you have repetitive individuals snow coning their garbage cans? I love the word, by the way. I'll be using it a lot.
We haven't determined a price structure on that. We haven't set price structure on that because we wanted to come to council first, see what the feeling was amongst council. There are 2 municipalities in Massachusetts that I looked at that have snow coning ordinances. So I would look to them to see what their protocol is on it. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but it would certainly be viable for everyone to have input on that so that we can make a decision collectively.
All right, great, thank you.
Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Chair.
Council President.
Renee, can we have a copy of your PowerPoint
Sure.
also? Awesome. Thank you.
Councilmember Bill, I just want to state too, we have trained some of the staff in regards to closing bins, senior citizens that have dealt with some issues, rain. Last thing we want to do is cause more chaos. So we will train the other staff if this does get done.
That's awesome, Chuck. It's good to hear that. I mean, the the more we cover that, those loose ends, no pun intended, I think the more efficient the system becomes and the less financial distress we'll have within the program and the barrels if we just do a little extra at the beginning from our guys. Because they know what they got to do. Most of the tenants don't.
They know if they don't, we're gonna hear about it.
Cool. Appreciate that.
So the next steps, where we're at currently, are researching the technology solutions, how we tie it in. Because right now we want to come up with a measure by which we can implement, roll out, and sustain a program until all software in-house is upgraded. We feel that there's a solution that we can work with. Most of the vendors that I've spoken to so far about barrels have a pretty sophisticated system, so that if we were able to export information to them in a spreadsheet format, that they'd be able to do the rollout for us. That'll be the last point I'll explain. So beginning, next step would be to do what's called set out studies, and that supports rate analysis. And so the rate analysis gives us very specifics and drills down to what the costs would be. But the set out studies are something that we could have assistance conducting that would not be at a cost to us, which I'll get to a couple bullet points down. From that information, we would create and send letters to residents so that they're informed about the barrels, informed about the options, informed how they can make the decision to sign up for size. And then we begin having the meetings with community. Right now, what we're looking at is talking to the Center for Sustainable Materials Management. They're associated with Syracuse University. Syracuse University and Center for Sustainable Materials Management has a direct contract with New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, meaning they're directly funded. So there is no cost for us to work with them and with any consultants that would work with us on their behalf. We've begun discussions so that we can get the information from them about what is a set out study, how do you conduct that, what information do you get from that. So not only are they willing to work with us through that process, but they're also a research partner. So we would be working with them, and as well with SUNY Stony Brook, who's offered to do trash audits, which we started ourselves last year. That's also at no cost because that's a funded program. They would continue to do that with us repeatedly for the next couple of years. So there'd be two steps. Not only would we have consultancy available to us at no charge beforehand, but it would also help us with the follow through and for the next steps. And they're also an educational liaison because they're tied into an educational institution. The amount of access that they have and the information that they have access to is tremendous. And finally, as part of the barrel program, we would require when we put it out to bid that the vendor that we selected would be required to have the expense of the delivery included in whatever offering they made to us. So that is all. And
I'm sorry, Renee, was that delivery to the residents?
yes,
So
yes.
not just bulk to the city and then we have to
Correct.
distribute them?
Correct. And so the vendors that I've spoken with thus far have all said that they can do it within a reasonable period of time. And they will probably, the three of them I've spoken to so far, would do it in 4 to 5 shipments that they would plan on, a certain amount of distance range. And depending on the population density would be determined as to whether it's 4 or 5 that they would do.
Chair,
Council President.
I'm like clueless, like how is this gonna work? And I kind of feel this as an overview, but the mechanics, how does it work? How do you you're a family of 4, how do you decide how many barrels? I don't know. I'm not really getting a lot of information yet.
So part of doing the whole assessment of what's most appropriate for your family, that's part of what we're going to do with the set out study. from my understanding, it's different than what we did as a waste audit last year, which was randomized, selected properties that we worked with the sanitation department with. So the consultant that we spoke to, what they suggested is that you pick 60 or 70 properties that they would assist us in selecting. They would want to do it in higher population density areas, lower population density areas, multifamily, single family and such. And then also check the set out of 2 to 3 properties next to it. And so it's completely randomized for the selection initially, and then not so randomized for the rest of it. And then they aggregate that data, and then they would help us to determine most appropriate offerings. And also that's how we would tend to determine the percentages of what percentage would be the 32 to 34 gallon, what percentage the 64 gallon, and what would be the 96 gallon. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. So the consultant, how long do you anticipate that happening? Because Tom said they're looking to implement this in January of 2023. I mean, that's a wicked turnaround to get education out there. I mean, we talked a while back changing the solid waste system to something different. Not sure what it was going to be, but in my opinion, you need a full year to educate folks, to get the barrels out there. I mean, highly, highly ambitious in the winter to implement it in January of 2023. I don't see that happening. I really don't.
Well, from the consultant's point of view and from the vendors that we've spoken to point of view, they would be able to do it in a fairly short period of time, 2 months or less in terms of the rollout piece of it. The work
So
that
would we hire a vendor and a consultant, or are they tied to DEC?
so the vendor, the consultant would be tied to Sustainable Materials Management, Syracuse University via DEC. So we would not be the.
So they do the study.
Correct. And
Who's the vendor then? Who's that?
so the vendor would be dependent on who we selected for the barrel. So far, I've spoken to 3 different companies. And it would depends on who we select as to, you know, the specific rollout. Right. Right.
So, okay, so that would go out to bid, and we'd have to wait for a consultant or this management system with Syracuse University to tell us, you know, pick some random, et cetera, households and all that. And then educate folks. I mean, you need a lot of time to educate folks. Councilmember Min, I hit the nail on the head. We have so many tenants, and there's so many absentee landlords that don't give a hoot about our solid waste stream, don't give a hoot about keeping their tenants accountable. We have tenants who care, and then we have tenants who don't care. The whole idea for me, to ensure that 210 to 20 comes down immensely. Number 2, the illegal dumping. And I just don't see how making people, you know, use a barrel is going to incentivize people to recycle more. Maybe I see that as a potential, but more importantly, the folks who are going to throw the bags on the street, whatever, they're doing it now. What is going to make them, because they have a barrel, they're going to be more accountable?
I
But,
think we're
you
looking
know,
at 2 different problems. One is the illegal dumping and the other one is the trash. This solves the issue of the trash. And
How though? How do you see this solving as trash?
because at this point, we've got a lot of management via the litter patrol officers of the violations being issued for the random stuff on the curb or on the sidewalk or wherever. A lot of it isn't so random. A lot of it has names. A lot of it has information. That's how violations get issued. So that's one piece of it. In terms of clearing up I can tell you a half dozen streets where I see snow coning, I see the garbage on the ground. That's where it starts making a difference. New York State has some laws that haven't passed yet, but that are aggressively being written to start addressing the issues of the illegal dumping.
If we're going to count on New York State
Well,
to
no,
address
so
our illegal dumping
agreed.
issues,
We want to
forget
have
that.
more
Not sure.
reinforcement within our own ordinances regarding the illegal dumping. There's two different chapters within the code. There's 188 and there's 247, and they don't necessarily agree. And so it's tightening down that information and making sure that the prosecutions happen. That's what's been problematic in the past, is getting into prosecution. It is starting to happen, but I think getting everything to work in agreement will help that as well.
Chair.
Councilperson.
Yeah, I
Steele.
just wanted to say, I think it's also an equality issue. For those of us who don't have the barrels like some folks do, I think it's very important that we equalize that across the board. And I want to commend you for the From the Ground Up program. I mean, I am loving that composting program. And I could use a smaller barrel than the one you're offering. And that's what I think we need to continue encouraging, that kind of education, because I had no idea how much I was throwing away until we started using the city's composting program. So I think it needs to be considered all around. And I'm sorry to take away from your presentation, but I just wanted to say that.
Not at all. I really appreciate that, because really that is the point of continuing to divert more and more over time. I'd mentioned to Jim a couple of years back that something I'd really like to do is have large scale collection events that divert usable furniture, usable materials. And that's something that I hope that over 2023, 2024, that we can do as a citywide thing, whether it's once a year or twice a year, so that the items get to the places that they need to be. We have a community in need that can use furniture that's in good shape. How do we get it from somebody who wants to get rid of it to somebody who needs it? So those are all considerations that we want to make as well. And so the diversion programs that I kind of pointed to and pointed out during the presentation are the things that we're going to expand over time. And really, as a city, we're developing a lot more bandwidth to be able to do that. RPI is now getting on board so that they're willing to help with that. We've got new textile bins up at RPI. They have 4 of them on campus and 4 of them off. With the work that we're doing with them, PS2 also has a textile bin. So we'll continue to increase those diversion programs as well.
Before I go to you, Councilwoman Mann, I just want to say one thing. For me, I look at this in a different way. Maybe there's 2 things I see that might be beneficial from this program. The first is we have a lot of individuals paying a full boat for the trash fee that are not using the space in a barrel. I have an elderly woman 2 doors down from me that barely puts out 1 can every 2 weeks, and it might be 2 bags every 2 weeks. And so I see a value there where maybe we could offset the expense that individuals who aren't using as much of the tipping fees and our services as a family that fills up 3 barrels. I could see that. The second thing I think that, and there's a long way to go here, but if properly implemented, I see that if we all had the same barrels, because right now with everybody having different barrels and one's got a 32 gallon, one's got a 64, you don't know who's really making a mess of the alley, because the one with the 32 is just putting trash out they got. So when they get a 64 gallon can or a 32 gallon can and they start to, here goes my word, snow cone again, we'll know who those people are, and we can work on correcting those bad addresses. But I don't, I think 2 things need to be accomplished here besides just the notification. In the recycling code, a long time ago when I was pressing to put addresses on the back of houses, we suggested that rather than create a separate legislation, that we would put it through the recycling program. I've seen none of that done yet. And I think that's very important, because as we move forward, and if you really want to create the success of cleaning up the city, because really for me, it's cleaning up the city. And I want to make sure that when our drivers go down that alley, they have an address that they can relate to that house that keeps doing it, so we can contact those people in that house and tell them, hey, you can't do this any longer. And we can try to get it down to where there's maybe only one or two violators in an entire alley, which would make a world of difference in every alley. But, you know, as everything, the numbers have to come out right, the program has to feel good, and the education is really, really critical. And I have to agree with Council President Mantello that these are aggressive schedules that you're looking to fit. And with that, and it can be done. You're right, it can be done. But it's going to take a lot of aggressive work on your part and by the people that you're going to bring in to do that part. It's got to be done properly, because if not, it'll just be another, you know, car running on 3 tires. And we don't want to do that. We've had that too many times in our past. And so we need to measure twice and cut once on this before we go putting it out. I respect the idea, and I hope we can bring it, because there's a lot of pieces that will help the city, but it has to be right so it doesn't hurt the residents and we don't push them. Now, I know we lost a lot of people to these outside companies because they offered these really stake bone deals. But I know that now is it 2 years or 3 years now, Andy? Yeah, but I'm just saying, it's been 2 years since they started going. So anytime now, we should start to see people start to come back when those bonus programs wear off, which means there's going to be a lot more work to handle for our staff. And we have to be prepared for that too. So we have to think about that piece of the puzzle too, so that when the operation comes out, it's fully educated. When the barrel system comes out, it's fully vested for the right numbers to make sense to people. And the sanitation department is ready for the additional work that they'll get as these people come off of these promotions from the other companies that are out there offering extremely crazy deals for the price of garbage. But that's all I wanted to say. Councilwoman Men, your floor.
Thank you. Sure. First of all, I wanted to say, I noticed the impact of the city barrels downtown. And it's a very positive impact, and whatever education you did, because I know there was some initial confusion and pushback. I know you're shocked, business owners, but it seems like it's working really well, and hopefully it's made it easier for you guys. So, you know, in speaking to the council president's concerns, I think that we've basically done a beta, and it's worked well. I also can't figure out how to game the system, which is what I immediately thought of when we were looking at pay as you throw, and because people always try to cheat. So, you know, I don't see a workaround here, which is excellent. And I think if it can increase our efficiency and give something very concrete, I do think it's an aggressive schedule, but I do think it's a doable schedule, and certainly one that a full-on implemented by Earth Day of 2023 sets a very clear, achievable goal. So I infinitely like this more than pay as you throw. And if any of you guys have suggestions for your ideal legislation for illegal dumpers, I think this council is extremely responsive to that, and so that we can prosecute illegal dumpers.
About the illegal dumper part, there are two, there's someone in the staff, or someone in the Senate and someone in the Assembly that are spearheading it on a statewide level. But most of what they've written thus far is geared toward downstate, but I wouldn't have any personal aversion to co-opting that information. And essentially, those legislators have said that they'd encourage municipalities to piggyback on that. So I'd certainly be willing to work on that along with the legal team and have as much input as possible from the council, because I think that's how we're going to get it written to the letter of how everyone wants it to be reflected.
Chair,
Council President.
I want to hear from Andy. Money, money, money. What's it
Money,
going to
money,
cost our
money,
poor
money.
people of Troy?
Money.
And Renee, just FYI, the legislature's out till January. Thank goodness.
I know you've been working every day.
They'll come back for like
So you off in
something
January?
important. No, I work. It's just not.
So while I log on to Zoom, just a couple notes before I get into this. In talking with Councilmember Gully, it was brought up if I could come this evening and go through what this would have cost or what this could cost, but there's significant amount of variability into it. There's also the component of, this is what I'm going to show this evening is if I was doing the budget as comptroller, what I would recommend is doing. Obviously Friday's my last day. Even if hopefully resolution 73 is approved, even if that's approved, that's a consultant capacity, not in the comptroller capacity. I'm just simply consulting. So I just want to give that as a preference. So I can consult and advise that that's the way to do it. There's no guarantee. And that's to the discretion of whoever's doing the budget. And that's not in a negative context or a positive context. So I just want to put that out there before I get into this. This is what I could envision doing it. It is a very simple method. But I do think when it comes to doing budget stuff, for those who have been on the council, I prefer simple methodology that has reasoning behind it. Don't make it overly complicated to implement on the financial side. I will also note to Councilman members Gully's point about people coming back from private collection. I was told this week from my office that we're starting to see what I'll call a trickle effect of, and it's more based off of people who are purchasing homes in Troy from residents who had private collection. They are canceling their private collection contracts and contacting the city to go, the property is coming back on city collection. So we are starting to see at least that happen. And we are prorating their bills and they are getting a bill from the city for the remainder of the fiscal year. So with that said, what I have is 3 scenarios. It's consistent with the current language in the city code delved around this, where it's the current calculation to come up with the per unit fee is total garbage fund expenditures less total other garbage fund revenues, which is everything but the fair share district and the rest of the city's unit count. That number for 2021 was $3.3 million. I will note, again, that's 2022's budget. Certainly budgeted revenues can go up. I will also say, though, that permanent salaries will go up based merely off contractual salary increases. I am guessing that you will see pension increases in next year's budget. That I can say right now that since the financial market was not in the position it was on March 31st, 2022 compared to March 31st, 2021 will lead to a pension increase. That is based off the trigger. I do not think it will be to the volume it was 2 years ago, but it's certainly something to be cognizant of. So an overview on how this was done. The total revenue that was needed, the total number of units, I rounded it down to 15,000. It's a little over 15,000 just for round number purposes. I'll discuss in a second where price per gallon comes from. The 3 different can sizes and assumed percentage used as we go through this. Allocated units is simply the percentage. So for example, 35 gallons, it's just simply 10% times 15,000. 64 gallons, 60% times 15,000, 96. Is that allocated gallons is the number of units times the number of gallons. Price per gallon, in this scenario, $3.11 is 3.3 million divided by 1,060,500. If you, based off of what Renee said earlier, where she's seen from other municipalities that the predominant usage is in a 64 gallon barrel. And you assume then percentage usage of 10% on 35 gallons, 60% of 64 gallons, 30% use 96 gallons. The price per can would be 109, 200, and 299, thereabout. So in this scenario, 35 gallon and 64 gallons, both see a significant percentage decrease annually from the current fee of 219, and 96 gallons pay more. In all the scenarios I'm going to go through, 96 gallons pay significantly more in this instance. More than 219 as I go through this. Are there
Andy?
questions on the calculation before I get to what the council should be cognizant of as we go through this? Because the other two scenarios is I want to show what happens in year one and the impact that it has on the second year of the program, looking out over 2 years.
Andy, I have a question.
Yes.
Let's say a household gets let's say a two-family house gets a 96-gallon barrel. And that's all they use between the two flats. Will they pay $298 or $299 or whatever it is, rounded off 300 for that barrel, and that covers their entire house? Or will they be required to get a barrel per unit?
I think it would be dependent on how the legislation is drafted. Right, because right now it's per unit. If the legislation is drafted to read, if the legislation's written to say every unit needs a barrel, then it changes, right? I don't have the answer to that question.
Chair?
Well, hold on. The reason I asked this question is that you're taking the revenue, the 3.3, which probably going to go up, right? Expenditure is going to go up. We're going to need more, say 3.5, whatever. But this is basing it on that total number, which tells me that if a two-family put stuff into a 96-gallon barrel and we were still accommodating the same volume of trash and garbage, that, I mean, the way I look at it, and that's why I'm trying to get the clarity there, but if let's say a two-family didn't snow cone, but only honestly, after utilizing recycling and composting, only had 196-gallon barrel for the 2 units, that 96-gallon barrel, they would pay $299 or whatever it is, will those numbers equate and calculate to the expenditures we'll have and revenues we'll need?
Sure, but
I love
there's
stumping
a
an
point that,
accountant.
no, yeah.
I love
I'm
it.
thinking the best
I know,
way
I
to
know. I know, that's right, you think.
So it would be accommodated by the fact that they could have the 35 gallon per unit, which is going to be more cost effective than were they to purchase or use the 96 gallon.
So they
would
could
get-
do that.
Exactly. So they'd be able to determine a smaller size per unit and therefore be able to still lower their overall bill.
All right, that's a good.
But
that's
to
good.
your, for the financial side, right, to your question, everything in this scenario goes back to 3.3 million, right? So if we're gonna get to what the elephant in the room on the financial side of this, just to be cognizant of it, because I can't say today what it would cost, and I'm gonna show in a second the issue there. But if the formula always goes back to total expenditures less other revenues, if that's the base of how the fees are calculated, and your barrel count is correct, you'll always have enough revenue you'll have enough revenue to cover it. And it's important to remember garbage fund revenues, if it's a barrel system, if it's a unit system, however it's set up to be to obtain revenue or expenditures, will always be recognized as it's billed. It's not recognized as it's paid.
I have one more question. I'm gonna turn it over to Council President. When you say total number of units, 15,000, that would be buildings, am I right? Not apartments?
So the total number of units that we build this year, it's rounded down. somewhere around 15,050 something, I believe. It's in the 15,000 range. So I just rounded it down. I brought it down just so there'd be round numbers in here.
All right, got it. Council President.
Yep. So Andy, that's what I was going to ask, because I thought it might have been around 17,000, the units.
Good. That's the net barrels, not the gross. I'm sorry, net units, not the gross units. The gross units are 17,000. I took the 2,000 off that we had just off.
Okay. And to get back to Councilmember Gully's, I think you have to, and I agree with Renee, do it per unit. And I'm not saying I support this, only because if you take Councilmember Gully's, we're essentially going back to potentially snow coning, if you want to talk about that. And, you know, say you have a 4 or 5 unit and you think maybe a 96 barrel is going to do the trick, but you're still then counting on people to do their bags. I think you have to go per unit in order to at least try to minimize the garbage that's going to be accumulated in that particular house, that house. You know, 4 unit, dump it in 96, it's not going to work. But a 4 unit with 4 smaller cans, potentially. And like I said, I'm not saying I support it or anything. Andy, exactly. Now, you know, what about, you know, I was looking up Cambridge. I think Renee mentioned Cambridge, and I was looking it up and I noticed like people purchasing extra barrels. It's pretty high up there in terms of dollars. So, you know, say you purchase or you get, so say the city, how you see it working. All right, so 1,500 people out there, or 1,500 units, I should say, are going to get the 35, 9,000, the middle of the road. There's no fee. This is all per barrel. We're not going to charge a fee, correct?
Correct.
So it's per barrel.
Per barrel.
So, you know, say, all right, how big are our black barrels now? Is that 64 or 96?
96.
So I'm gonna pay $300 as opposed to 220, because we have a family of 4. We fill with recycling, you know, we fill a 90, you know, at least 2/3 of that 96. So say I'm in between 64 and 96, I'm gonna be paying 300 a year as opposed to 220.
In this scenario, yes. I'm going to show you 2 other scenarios where you
Oh.
where you're not. I mean, you're still paying more.
And
But it's very dependent on assumed percentage used. That's on the financial side of this, where the devil is in that detail, because it can swing like that. And we're talking 10-15% variances swing it significantly.
what do you mean?
So I can show it right now.
Sure.
So in the second scenario, the assumed percentage is 10% for the small barrel, 30% now for the medium-sized barrel, 60% for the large barrel. So your prices now have gone from, the small barrel goes from 109 to 96. Your medium-sized barrel goes from 200 to 175, and your large barrel goes from 300 to 263. It is entirely dependent upon what that barrel count is. In this scenario, it drove the cost down. However, now if you go back to the initial scenario, right, 10, 60, 30, and just simply switch 64 and 96 to say it's equal. Again, it goes from 109 to to 102, 200 to 187, to 300 to 280. The scenario one's the highest cost. Essentially, what you will see if this comes to fruition, and it's in the early stages, the higher the percentage of larger barrels, the lower the fee in the city. However, I will note though, if the first year, if you look at this in reverse, and the city does 10, assumes in the budget 10, 45, 45, and it ends up being 10, 60, 30. It goes the opposite way. That's where I say the devil is in that detail, that count in the first year has got to be as accurate as humanly possible.
Chair.
I just, one question before I get started over to Councilwoman Mann. How do you get that accuracy, Andy? What's the plan? Renee, go ahead.
That's where us talking with the consultants and the folks from the Sustainable Materials Management collectively, between Sustainable Materials Management and the consultant, I think they've got about 50 years of experience collectively. The consultant 30 plus and Sustainable Materials over 20. And so that way we're not speculating on something that we're not certain about because we haven't designed it before. And we're leaning into the information that they've done for, in the case of the consultant, dozens, if not hundreds of municipalities that they've worked with on this. And so part of that set out survey, going to what Carmela was saying, is maybe you really are a 64 gallon. And are you compressing the garbage at all? Are you getting the things out of it that we might be able to help you get out of the trash? And so part of it is making sure that the programs that we offer, the diversion programs, are as robust as possible and that as many people know about them as possible. And so that's part of the education outreach work that we've started for the past year since Naomi has been there. And I also like to point out that in-house, we also have the account clerk that would be part of this process, who's been part of the process in increasing the capacity of our department.
Do you expect to look at any type of incentivized process to get people to move more towards recycling? Now, I know they're going to save money on their garbage, but how do we get that into their heads that, hey, you know what? If you were to work with us and get rid of your food waste and just throw your plastics and paper in here, you could save even more money. Is there a way, how you get that message out to and it really, the property owners are really the key here because they pay the bill, but really it's the tenants that we have to educate. Does this company offer that process to saturate the residents with the information properly?
They help to design the information as well as like the recycling partnership. And there's a number of other organizations that Naomi and I have tied into that we're getting input from, where there are really successful programs. We tend to be looking to some of the larger counties like Tompkins County, Onondaga County, Ulster County, who all have really robust programs to see what their successes are and how they've approached it, so that we're not redesigning the wheel, and to do many of the same models that they're working with, and that we're building those programs like the composting workshops that we're doing. We're having 6 of them this year. We increased the number of household hazardous. Those are automatically starting to diminish the amount of waste that our households are producing. And I've been measuring over the past 3.5 years what's happened with our recycling percentages. Our recycling percentages have consistently gone up and our trash volumes have consistently gone down. So statistically, we're headed in the right direction. I think that will help us as well.
Great. Councilperson Mann.
So, one of the things that Andy, getting back to the different scenarios, part of this is decoupling number of units in one building from amount of trash actually generated by that unit. Because I think about a 4-unit apartment building, which is billed about $880 a year, and 4 people who live in a single family home who are billed $219 a year. And who does that the type of people that are living in an apartment are on already, it's like they have lower cost of living. That's our magic middle. And those are the people that if we price out versus a family of 4. And, you know, I know, like, just knowing my trash consumption and my tenants' trash consumption, we operate on 10 people on 396-gallon barrels a week with decent recycling. So, you know, I'm looking at the majority of the city, which is multifamily, this working in their favor, as well as streamlining pickup and making it easier for you guys, also saving us money. And I think we'll see resistance from our single family homes who will have 4 people in one house and they will have to pay more for a trash can. But I think we're going to see more support from multifamily because you can have the same number of people living in the same amount of physical space and they're billed radically differently. This is going to be one of the ways we keep our city, our cost of living in our city down and encourage recycling. And is it possible, I guess my question for you, sorry, we can decouple unit numbers from barrels per building, correct? Because if we're,
Can you say that again, please?
can we decouple right now we're being billed per unit. And what this is proposing is we're billed per barrel, regardless of the number of units. If you don't have the appropriate number of barrels for your trash consumption, you're getting fees and fines until you get the appropriate number of barrels. That's the motivation. Because, you know, I think the point was raised, oh, well, just a barrel for every unit. Well, I have 8 apartments in my house, which has, you know, a smaller lot size than, you know, some of my other colleagues in council. And I don't have space for 8 barrels. I don't need 8 barrels. I need 3.
So if you're, if you're asking, is it possible? I think you're asking, is it possible when billing to separate it out? I can speak to that. Again, a lot of code comes down to how it's written in an ordinance, right? To amend 247 of the code. If this were to move forward, the finance operation component of billing this is getting drastically overhauled. You're looking at, no matter how that ordinance is written, that whole process is gutted. Because we have just a simple unit count right now, right? You're talking now of changing all that over to barrels, and in itself, you're gonna have to switch over to my house right now is 1, and it's just listed as 1, and it's all 1 column. You're now having 3 columns, and you gotta switch it all over. So is it possible to decouple it from a billing perspective? Certainly. And I'm not saying that the workload that comes with that shouldn't be a detriment to doing it. There is a workload component to switching it over, getting it up and running. Then from there, it's cleaning it up. It's that first stage of implementation. The bill is where the work lies.
Sure.
Chair, could Andy finish his presentation and then we?
That was
That's
it.
it.
That was it. Just the 3 scenarios. Keep it simple.
Chair.
Council President. Yeah, we're getting past the 11th hour.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Bo
you
needs
know-
Bo needs a
Oh,
hug.
he's sound asleep.
Andy, you know, to Councilmember Men's point, each household is different. And I think when you go to this barrel system, I just find it, I do find it very interesting, but I also find it very complicated because each house is different. Councilmember Men has 5 units, say. She has 1 resident in one of the units, 3 residents in one of the other units, 4 residents in the 3rd unit. she might need a 64, a 35, and maybe even share a barrel. I mean, I guess from that perspective, I find it very, very complicated. If you indeed are trying to get away from the units, look to get people to recycle more, educate them more, and I do applaud all the diversion programs, and I want to plug Tom and Chuck and his folks. You're doing awesome. I get it. However, from my perspective, I'm not sold on the barrel yet. You're definitely going to have to sell me. I'm very concerned budget-wise. We all know when the temporary trash fee went in, it was $1.60. Now we're looking at $2.20, and it keeps going up and up and up. And the fear was exactly what you said, Andy. When you plug in some of those numbers that first year, I see us maybe $1 million, $1.5 million short. And then all of a sudden, we're going to have to hit the taxpayers with either a tax, well, not a tax hike because they're separate accounts. Boom, you're going to get hit with double next year because we have to make up, et cetera, whatever, how to make it up. So I'm super concerned on the mathematics. I'm concerned on the complications of the multi-units, but I'm intrigued by the, just the perspective of really trying to get people to think more in terms of recycling, the diversion programs, et cetera. And the whole idea here is to get people to minimize their waste. So we're not seeing so much garbage on the streets. But I don't know if this is the answer, and I'm not sold yet. So a lot of work to be done. I don't see it happening in January 2023.
Councilperson Conley Wilson.
Yeah, I just wanted to state, I think we really do need better barrels. I know the barrels that I have in my current apartment are beat up. They're not working. I'm sure they're like leaking all kinds of things. And I know that like my situation is not the only one. I really do think having kind of these 3 different sets of barrels is really great. And I hope that that will also help. It sounds like it's gonna help our waste management team as well. And, I think really trying to let folks know, like there are different, like most of our waste, I think it's like 30% or something like that, or I think maybe 30% of your groceries end up just going directly to the landfill. So like that's a really big step that we can start making, we have been making with diverting some of the waste. So, people don't need the 96 barrels and all of that. I'm in support of this. I mean, I think sure there's probably going to be some things that can be improved upon that, but I really do think it's worth that investment to make sure that like everyone who's getting trash barrels, it's all consistent, it's easy to use. Obviously, there's the finances that we need to figure out. I don't know if there's any like grants or anything like that that could help fund this or help support this, but I really commend the team and Renee especially for doing all this research to try and find low cost ways to actually get the things that we need to get. Like I think I could picture the literature that we need to get, like let's say we start mailing out some things to residents, to property owners and to tenants so they know what's going on. I love the idea of going to community meetings, maybe having an informational session that's just on this kind of topic, and just getting the word out, because I think even last week, I think a lot of residents learned a lot about how the city functions just based on those informational sessions.
Chair,
Councilperson Steele.
I think we can all agree on one thing, that trash is not cheap. And just like a lot of other things, the price is only going to continue to go up. So I commend you for looking outside the box and looking at ways that we can address this, because this is not going to be a reduction to the city going forward. It's a huge expense and something we're gonna have to deal with, whether we like it or not.
Coming. Wait till we have to start paying for recycling goods, and it's gonna get a little hairier. But anyways, before I take a motion to adjourn, which I'm sure everybody's smiling about, Just a quick opinion. I like the barrel program. I like its ability to control three factors in the city with the residents and the properties. However, I just ask you to please don't try to push it to get it started just to get it started. Let's take the time, because this has got some great stuff in it. There's great pieces here. Let's take the time to really look over some of the thoughts tonight. Let's take the time to really think about this program to get full saturation amongst the public, whether it's those public events and different things over this summer, maybe a questionnaire or flyer that you can put out to people, asking them what they feel is a good barrel size for the family, just kind of getting generated information from when we have these events like the farmer's market with 6,000 people or Powers Park with 300 to 1,000 people, or any one of the shows that we have. Let's start utilizing those processes there to get information from the residents who live here. I like it. There's like everything else, you got to shave off the edges to get that round ball, but we need to keep doing that. And I just wish you not to rush, take your time so that this can long-term be a successful program for the future of the city residents. At this time, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second,